Hello, everyone, and welcome back to X-Ranger. Before we begin, I thought it would be interesting if each of you could leave a comment indicating which part of the world you're joining us from. Also, don't forget to like and subscribe if you're enjoying the episodes. Now let's get comfortable, relax, and start our program. I've never really told this story to anyone outside my family. It's been almost 30 years, but I still get this weird feeling in my stomach when I think about it. This happened in the summer of '94, when I was 11 years old. We were visiting my grandparents, who lived in this old family home near Vernon, New Jersey. It was this big old house sitting on a wooded ridge outside of town. The land behind their house had this steep drop, so the kitchen window at the back was actually about 8 feet above ground level. My grandparents, Harold and Eleanor, had lived there forever. The place was surrounded by woods, the kind of woods that seem normal during the day, but take on this whole different feel when the sun goes down. We'd visit every summer, and I always loved it there. The freedom to run around outside, the smell of my grandma's cooking, fishing with my grandpa, all those normal childhood summer things. That night, we were all gathered in the living room. There were 4 men, my dad, my 2 uncles, and my grandpa, 3 women, my mom, aunt, and grandma, and 5 kids, including me and my cousins. We were just hanging out, the adults talking about boring adult stuff while us kids were playing a board game on the floor. I remember it was getting late, probably around 9 or 10 at night. I noticed my grandma Eleanor kept glancing toward the kitchen. At first, I didn't think much of it, but she kept doing it over and over. She had this weird, nervous look on her face. Then I saw her lean over to my grandpa and whisper something. I couldn't hear what she said, but my grandpa's face changed immediately. He got this serious look I'd never seen before. Without saying anything to the rest of us, he stood up and headed down the hallway toward their bedroom. Then he called out, "Jim, Dave, Mike, come here for a minute." That was my dad and my uncles. They all looked at each other confused, but followed him. I was curious. When you're 11, you want to know everything the adults are doing. So I followed them down the hall. No one noticed me hanging back by the doorway. My grandpa was opening his gun cabinet and pulling out his 12-gauge shotgun. I remember exactly what he said. "There's something at the kitchen window. Been there a while. Eleanor's been seeing it." My dad kind of laughed it off. "Probably just a raccoon, Pop," he said. But Grandpa Harold wasn't laughing. "Raccoons don't stand 8 feet off the ground," he said, loading shells into the shotgun. "Get yourself something. Dave, take the 30-30. Mike, grab that 20-gauge. Jim, you know where the pistol is." I remember my dad and uncles exchanging this look. They weren't laughing anymore. Something about the way my grandpa was acting changed their attitude completely. These were all tough guys, men who'd been hunting their whole lives, but suddenly they were serious and tense. My grandpa saw me standing there and didn't tell me to go back to the living room like I expected. Instead, he nodded toward a smaller rifle mounted on the wall. "Daniel, you know how to use the MT-22, right? I taught you last summer." I nodded, feeling this weird mix of fear and pride. He took it down and handed it to me. "Stay behind us," he said, "just in case." We went through the kitchen where my grandma was now standing, arms crossed, looking worried. She didn't say anything when she saw me with the rifle. That's when I knew this was really serious. She would normally never let me handle a gun without a huge lecture first. My grandpa led us out the front door. The night was warm, but not hot. Typical Jersey summer night. The woods around the house were pitch black, beyond the reach of the porch light. We walked around the side of the house, staying close together. I could hear the cicadas and frogs making noise, but something felt off. There was this weird tension in the air. When my grandpa and Uncle Dave reached the back corner of the house, they suddenly stopped. I couldn't see past them, but I saw my grandpa raise his shotgun. Without any warning, he fired both barrels, one after another. Boom! Boom! The noise was deafening in the quiet night. I completely freaked out. I dropped the rifle right there on the ground and ran. I didn't even think about it, just pure fear taking over. I ran back around to the front of the house, my heart feeling like it was going to explode. When I got to the front door, I grabbed the handle and pulled, but it was locked. Someone inside had locked it after we went out. I started pounding on the door, screaming for my mom to let me in. I was in full panic mode, tears streaming down my face. While I was standing there pounding on the door, I had this feeling. You know that feeling when you're being watched? I looked up toward the roofline of the house. That's when I saw it. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. There was this massive head and wide shoulders silhouetted against the house. It was huge, not like any animal I'd ever seen. The thing that really got me were its eyes. They were greenish yellow, and they reflected the porch light, but they didn't blink. They were just staring down at me. I couldn't move, I couldn't breathe, I couldn't even scream anymore. It was like time stopped for a few seconds. Then all hell broke loose. I could hear screaming from inside the house. My mom and aunt must have seen it through the window. There was shouting from the back where my grandpa and uncles were. I was still frozen at the front door, unable to look away from those eyes. My dad came sprinting around the corner of the house, saw me standing there and rushed over. He pulled me against him, shielding me with his body, and pounded on the door. "Open the door! Open the goddamn door!" he was yelling. The door finally opened, and my mom pulled us inside. My dad slammed the door shut behind us and locked it. Everyone was talking at once. My cousins were crying. My mom was holding on to me so tight it hurt. My aunt was on the phone trying to call the police, but her hands were shaking so bad she kept misdialing. My grandpa and uncles came in through the back door a minute later. They locked everything, doors, windows, even the little window in the bathroom that nobody could fit through. My grandpa kept his shotgun right by his side. "What the hell was that?" my dad asked, his voice shaking. My grandpa just shook his head. "Don't know. Never seen anything like it. Too big for a bear. Too fast." That's when my grandma said something that made everything even more terrifying. "Where are the dogs?" My grandparents had 4 dogs. 2 German shepherds and 2 mixed breeds. They always patrolled the yard at night, always, but none of us had heard them bark, not once. We stayed up all night. The adults took turns watching, guns ready. Us kids were supposed to sleep in the back bedroom, but none of us could. We just huddled together, jumping at every little sound. I kept seeing those eyes when I closed mine. When morning finally came, we were all exhausted, but too wired to sleep. The police had come during the night, but found nothing except some broken branches at the edge of the woods. They said it was probably just a bear and left. Around 6 in the morning, all 4 dogs came back. They were trembling, tails between their legs. They came right into the house and wouldn't leave. This was completely opposite of their normal behavior. They loved being outside and would usually scratch at the door to be let out first thing in the morning. But that day, they wouldn't go near the doors. They just huddled in the living room, whining softly. We left that afternoon. My parents decided we'd cut our visit short. I remember the drive home. Everyone was quiet. My dad kept checking the rearview mirror like he thought we were being followed. For years, I had nightmares about those eyes. Sometimes I still do. I never got a good look at the whole thing, just that massive silhouette and those unblinking eyes. But it was big, really big, and the way it moved, silent and fast, wasn't natural. When I was about 20, I finally asked my grandpa about that night. We were sitting on his porch, just the 2 of us. He was getting older by then, and I thought maybe he'd tell me it was just a bear or something, help me put it behind me. Instead, he took a long sip of his coffee and said, "It wasn't a bear." That's all he would say. It wasn't a bear. My grandpa was a hunter his whole life. He knew every animal in those woods. If he said it wasn't a bear, it wasn't a bear. I've looked into it over the years. That part of New Jersey has had Bigfoot sightings for decades. I never believed in that stuff before, but after what I saw, I don't know. Whatever was outside my grandparents' house that night was massive. It was fast, and it scared 4 dogs so badly they wouldn't go outside. It stood at least 8 feet tall to be looking in that kitchen window, and those eyes, I'll never forget those eyes. My grandparents sold that house a few years later and moved to Florida. My grandpa passed away in 2008, and my grandma followed a year after. Sometimes I wonder if whatever that thing was is still out there in those woods, watching other families through their windows at night. I don't tell this story much because people think you're crazy when you talk about Bigfoot, but I know what I saw, and more importantly, I know what my grandpa saw. A man who spent his entire life in those woods and knew every animal in them. Whatever it was real, and it was watching us. Story 2. I've never told this story publicly before. I'm not sure why I'm sharing it now after almost 40 years. Maybe it's because I still think about it, especially during October when the leaves start to change and that particular chill settles in the air. Maybe writing it down will help me make sense of what happened. I still don't have explanations. It was October of 1984. I was working the late shift at the paper mill in Harper's Creek, about 30 miles outside of Portland. I was 23 then, living in my first apartment on my own after moving out of my parents' place. I wasn't making great money, but it was enough to get by. That particular morning, October 12th, I finished my shift at 6 a.m. The sky was still dark, that deep blue-black before dawn starts to break. I remember being completely exhausted. We'd been short-staffed that week, and I'd pulled a double shift the day before. All I wanted was to get home and crash. My car was in the shop, timing belt issues, so I'd been carpooling with a co-worker named Pete for the past few days. But Pete had called in sick that night, which meant I was stuck taking the early morning bus. The nearest stop was about half a mile from the mill, down a road that cut through a stretch of dense forest. I remember checking my watch as I left the building. 6:15. The bus wouldn't arrive until 6:45, but I figured I'd rather wait at the stop than in the mill's break room, which smelled like cigarettes and burnt coffee. The walk to the bus stop wasn't bad. The road was poorly lit, with just a few street lamps spaced too far apart. But I had a flashlight. The air was crisp, cold enough to see my breath. There was no wind, just complete stillness. Looking back now, it was too still. I reached the bus stop around 6:25. It was just a simple bench with a small shelter sitting at the edge of the forest. Across the road was nothing but more trees. No houses, no businesses, just wilderness. I sat down on the bench and leaned back, closing my eyes for a moment. God, I was tired. My muscles ached from standing all night, and my eyes burned from the fluorescent lights of the mill. I must have dozed off for a minute or two. What woke me was a sound from the forest behind me. A cracking noise, like someone stepping on a branch. My eyes snapped open and I sat up straight, suddenly alert. It was probably just a deer, I told myself. The woods were full of them, but then I heard it again. Crack. Pause. Crack. It wasn't random movement, it was deliberate, methodical, like footsteps. I turned around slowly, peering into the darkness between the trees. The forest was dense, the undergrowth thick. My flashlight beam only penetrated about 15 feet before the darkness swallowed it. I scanned the tree line, looking for movement, for shapes, for anything. That's when I smelled it. I've worked in a paper mill for years, so I know all kinds of industrial smells, chemicals, pulp, the works. This wasn't anything like that. This was organic, like wet fur and something rotting. It wasn't strong at first, just a whiff that made me wrinkle my nose. I checked my watch again. 6:32. Still more than 10 minutes until the bus would arrive. The cracking sounds had stopped, but now I could hear something else. Breathing. Deep, heavy breathing, like something large, trying to be quiet, but not quite managing it. It was coming from the same direction as the footsteps. I stood up, gripping my flashlight tighter. "Hello?" I called out. My voice sounded small and pathetic in the pre-dawn silence. No response. Just that breathing. I swept my flashlight across the tree line again, more deliberately this time. Nothing. But the breathing was definitely there, and it was getting louder. Whatever it was getting closer. Is someone there? I tried again, trying to keep my voice steady. This isn't funny. That's when I saw it. Or rather, I saw the eyes. Two reflective orbs caught in my flashlight beam about 7 feet off the ground. They were spaced wide apart, wider than any humans, and they were fixed directly on me. My heart froze. Those eyes didn't blink. They just stared, reflecting my flashlight with a dull, yellowish glow. I took a step back, nearly tripping over the bench. The eyes moved with me, tracking my movement. Then, slowly, they rose higher. Whatever this thing was, it was standing up. The smell intensified suddenly, becoming so strong I could taste it. Wet fur, decay, and something else, something musky and wild. I heard a low sound, not quite a growl, not quite a moan. It was deep, resonating in my chest like bass at a concert. The hair on my arms stood on end. The eyes were now at least 8 feet off the ground, maybe higher. I couldn't see a body, just those eyes, and occasionally the outline of something massive shifting in the darkness. I should have run. Any sane person would have. But fear had rooted me to the spot. My legs felt like they were filled with concrete. The thing took a step forward. I heard the undergrowth crush beneath what must have been an enormous weight. Another step. It was approaching the edge of the trees now, where the meager light from the street lamp might reveal it. I didn't want to see it. Some primal part of my brain was screaming that if I saw it clearly, something terrible would happen. That seeing it would make it real in a way I couldn't handle. I checked my watch again, 6:37. Where the hell was the bus? The creature, and I was certain now it was some kind of animal, took another step. I could see a massive silhouette now, broader than any man I'd ever seen. It had to be at least 3 feet wide at the shoulders. The head was oddly shaped, coming to what looked like a point at the top. "Stay back," I said, my voice cracking. I raised my flashlight like a weapon, though what good it would do against something that size I had no idea. It paused. For a moment I thought it might retreat back into the forest. Then it made that sound again, that deep, resonant moan. And I realized with horror that it was mimicking me. Not my words, but the cadence, the pitch of my voice. I backed up onto the road. If I ran now, I might make it back to the mill before this thing caught me. But the mill was half a mile away, and whatever this was, it looked built for speed. It stepped fully out of the tree line. Even now, decades later, I struggled to describe what I saw. It was massive, covered in dark hair or fur. The proportions were all wrong for a bear. The arms too long, the chest too broad, the head too small for its frame. It stood upright, perfectly balanced on 2 legs, at least 8 feet tall, maybe taller. What struck me most were the hands. They weren't paws or claws. They were hands, with visible fingers hanging at its sides. Each hand looked large enough to wrap completely around my head. I stood there, frozen in the middle of the road, as this thing, this impossible thing, stared at me with those reflective eyes. It tilted its head slightly, almost like it was curious. Then it took another step toward me. That broke my paralysis. I turned and ran, not toward the mill, but down the road in the direction the bus would come from. I ran faster than I've ever run in my life, my lungs burning, my legs pumping. I didn't look back, I didn't dare. I could hear it behind me, not running but walking, fast, deliberate steps. Crack, crack, crack on the asphalt. It was following me. My flashlight beam bounced wildly as I ran, creating twisted shadows that seemed to reach for me. The road stretched endlessly ahead, empty and dark. I risked a glance over my shoulder. It was still there, maybe 50 yards behind me, still walking, but covering ground quickly with those long strides. Its eyes caught my flashlight again, 2 points of light in the darkness. I pushed myself harder, my breath coming in ragged gasps. My side was cramping painfully, but adrenaline kept me moving. That's when I saw the headlights in the distance, coming around a bend in the road. The bus. It had to be the bus. Relief flooded through me. I waved my flashlight frantically, hoping the driver would see me. The headlights grew larger, brighter. I could make out the shape of the bus now. I glanced back again. The creature had stopped in the middle of the road. It was just standing there, watching. Even from this distance, I could feel its eyes on me. The bus was getting closer. I stumbled to the side of the road where it would stop, still waving my flashlight. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice hoarse. "Stop! Please stop!" The bus slowed as it approached. I could see the driver peering out curiously. I must have looked insane. A disheveled young man, wild-eyed and panicked, waving a flashlight at 6:45 in the morning. I looked back one more time as the bus pulled up beside me. The creature was gone. The road was empty. The bus doors opened with a hydraulic hiss. The driver, an older man with grey stubble, looked at me with concern. "You all right, son?" he asked. I couldn't speak. I just nodded and climbed aboard, my legs shaking so badly I almost fell. I paid my fare with trembling hands and collapsed into the nearest seat. As the bus pulled away, I stared out the window at the empty road behind us. There was nothing there, no massive figure, no glowing eyes, just darkness and trees. But as we rounded the bend, I saw something that chills me to this day. Just for a moment, silhouetted against the lightning sky, I saw a large figure standing at the edge of the forest where the bus stop was. It raised one long arm, almost like it was waving goodbye. Then it was gone, and I was left wondering if I'd imagined the whole thing. I never took the early morning bus again. I paid a fortune in taxi fares until my car was fixed. I never told anyone at work what happened. What would I say? That I saw some kind of giant, hairy creature in the woods, that it followed me down the road? They'd think I was crazy or drunk or both. Years later, I came across a book about Bigfoot sightings in the Pacific Northwest. There was a section about Harper's Creek, about loggers and mill workers reporting strange encounters in those same woods. Large footprints found in mud, strange howls in the night, massive, dark figures watching from the trees. I've thought about reporting what I saw many times over the years, but who would believe me? And what good would it do now, almost 40 years later? All I know is that sometimes when October comes around and the air gets that certain chill, I remember those eyes watching me from the darkness. I remember that deep, resonant sound it made, mimicking my voice, and I wonder if it's still out there in those woods, waiting for someone else to sit alone at that bus stop in the early morning darkness. I've never gone back to Harper's Creek. I moved away from Oregon entirely the following year, but sometimes in my dreams, I'm still running down that empty road, the sound of heavy footsteps behind me, getting closer and closer. And sometimes I wonder what would have happened if the bus hadn't come when it did. Story 3. I've been putting off writing this down for weeks now, but I can't get it out of my head. Maybe sharing it will help. I'm still trying to make sense of what happened that night at Clendening Lake. It was the second Saturday in September. The weather had been perfect, not too hot, not too cold, just right for fishing. My buddy Dave and I had been planning this trip for a while. We both needed to get away from our daily bullshit, you know? Work stress, bills, relationship drama, the usual crap. Fishing has always been my escape. We chose Clendening because it's quiet and secluded, especially the backwaters. I've been fishing there since I was a kid. My dad used to take me there before he passed. I know those waters like the back of my hand, or at least I thought I did. We arrived around 4 in the afternoon. The lake was beautiful as always, nestled in the hills near Cadiz, Ohio. The trees were just starting to show hints of fall colors. We took my old Ford F-150 down this narrow dirt road that most people don't know about. It leads to this hidden spot where the fishing is usually amazing and you never see another soul. We set up our gear near this little inlet where the carp and catfish tend to gather when the sun starts going down. Dave brought beer, I brought sandwiches, and we were all set for a peaceful evening of fishing and bullshitting about life. Normal stuff, you know? Everything was fine for the first few hours. We caught a couple decent-sized catfish, nothing spectacular, but it wasn't really about the catch. It was about being out there, away from everything. The sun was setting, turning the sky this deep orange color that reflected off the water. If I'd known what was coming, I would have packed up right then and there. It was around 8:30 when things started getting weird. The sun had fully set, and we had our headlamps on. Dave was in the middle of telling me about this girl he'd met at work when we heard it, this sharp, piercing scream that cut through the night. It wasn't an animal call, at least not one I recognized, and I've heard pretty much everything in these woods. Coyotes, bobcats, foxes, you name it. This was different. It sounded almost human, but not quite. It was higher pitched and lasted way too long. It made the hair on the back of my neck stand up instantly. "What the hell was that?" Dave whispered, his fishing rod frozen in his hands. I shook my head. No idea. We both sat there, perfectly still, listening. The woods had gone completely silent. No crickets, no frogs, nothing. That's when you know something's wrong. When the forest goes quiet, then it happened again. The same scream, but from a different direction, like whatever made it had moved, and then again from yet another spot. Within the span of maybe 10 minutes, we heard that scream 3 or 4 times, each from a different location around the lake. The closest one couldn't have been more than 100 yards away. That's when Dave did something I still give him shit for. He cupped his hands around his mouth and yelled, "Hello? Is someone there?" I was about to tell him to shut up when the scream came again, immediately, like whatever it was had responded directly to Dave's call. It wasn't an echo. It was a response, and it was close. Too close. We looked at each other, and I could see the same realization in Dave's eyes that I was feeling. Whatever was out there, it was intelligent enough to respond. It knew we were there, and it was circling us. "Let's just keep fishing," I said, trying to sound calmer than I felt. Probably just some drunk hikers messing with us. But I didn't believe that for a second. These backwaters are miles from any hiking trail, and you'd need a boat or have to know the hidden dirt road to get here. Plus, something about that sound, it wasn't human. I can't explain it, but it just wasn't. We tried to go back to fishing, but our hearts weren't in it anymore. Every little sound from the woods made us jump. For several minutes, everything was quiet. I started to think maybe whatever it was had moved on. Then we heard the splashes. The first one sounded like someone had dropped a bowling ball into the water, a heavy, deliberate splash about 50 yards out from shore. Dave and I both jerked our heads up, scanning the water with our headlamps, but saw nothing but ripples. "Probably just a big carp jumping," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, there was another splash. Same sound, different location. Over the next 15 minutes, there were 5 distinct splashes, spaced out by a few minutes each. They weren't random. They were moving in a pattern around the cove where we were fishing, and they were getting closer. "Jake, I think we should go," Dave said, already reeling in his line. I nodded, not wanting to admit how badly I wanted to get out of there. We quickly packed up our gear, keeping our headlamps pointed toward the water, watching for any movement. I kept thinking I saw shadows moving between the trees on the opposite shore, but whenever I tried to focus on them, there was nothing there. We gathered our stuff and started heading back toward my truck, which was parked about 200 yards away. The path back was narrow, with dense woods on both sides. Every step felt like we were being watched. I kept hearing twigs snapping in the forest, but whenever we stopped to listen, the sound stopped too. We were about halfway to the truck when we heard a distinct rustling sound from the trees to our right. We both froze. Dave's flashlight beam trembled slightly as he pointed it toward the noise. "Let's just keep moving," I whispered. That's when it happened. There was a whooshing sound past my ear, and then a splash in the water just 5 feet to our left. Something had been thrown, a rock or a stick, and it had barely missed us before landing in the water. "What the fuck?" Dave hissed, his voice cracking. I spun around, pointing my light into the woods, but saw nothing. "Hey!" I shouted, my voice sounding pathetically small in the vast darkness. "We know you're there! Show yourself!" Nothing. Just the gentle lapping of water against the shore and the distant hoot of an owl that had apparently decided it was safe to make noise again. We stood there for what felt like forever, straining to hear or see anything unusual. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. After several minutes of nothing but normal night sounds, I finally whispered to Dave, "Let's go. Now." We practically ran the rest of the way to my truck. I fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely get them in the ignition. As we pulled away, tires spinning in the dirt, I refused to look in the rearview mirror. I didn't want to see if something was watching us leave. The drive home was almost completely silent. What do you say after something like that? It wasn't until we were back on the main highway with streetlights and other cars around us that Dave finally spoke. "What do you think that was?" I shook my head. "I don't know, man. But that's not entirely true. I do have a theory. I've spent my whole life in these woods. I know every animal call, every natural sound. What we experienced wasn't normal wildlife behavior. The way it screamed in response to Dave's call, the way the splashes moved in a pattern, the rock thrown with such precision. Whatever was out there was intelligent. It was aware of us. It was interacting with us. I've been back to Clendening Lake since then, but only to the public areas, never back to that secluded spot. Sometimes when I look across the water toward those backwaters, I get this feeling, like something's watching me from the tree line. Dave refuses to go fishing with me anymore. Can't say I blame him. I've tried researching similar experiences in the area. Turns out there have been other reports over the years. Strange screams, rocks thrown, large shadows moving through the trees. Most people laugh it off as pranks or overactive imaginations, but I was there. I heard it. I felt its presence. Whatever was lurking in those woods that night, it wasn't human, but it wasn't just an animal either. It was something in between, something that knew exactly what it was doing. Testing us, scaring us, letting us know we were in its territory. And the worst part? I think it could have done a lot more than throw a rock if it wanted to. I still go fishing, but never alone, and never after dark. And I'm always listening now, always watching the tree line, because once you know something's out there, you can never unknow it. That night at Clendening Lake changed something in me. I used to feel at home in those woods. Now I feel like a visitor who's being tolerated, for now. Story 4. I've spent almost 23 years trying to explain what happened that night in October 2000, and I still don't have a good answer. I've told the story to a handful of people over the years, but most just look at me like I'm crazy or had too much to drink. Maybe writing it down will help me process it, I don't know. What I do know is that I saw something that shouldn't exist, and it's haunted me ever since. My cousin Mark had this property near Powell, Tennessee. Nothing fancy, just a double-wide trailer sitting on about 3 acres at the end of a gravel road. The place backed right up to this thick stretch of woods that ran for miles, eventually hitting an old creek bed that had been dry for years, according to Mark. He'd bought the place as a fixer-upper and asked if I could come stay for a couple weeks to help with some projects while he worked nights at the paper mill in town. The setup was perfect. During the day, I'd work on whatever project Mark had lined up, fixing the deck, clearing brush, patching the roof, and when he'd leave for his shift around 6, I'd have the whole place to myself. I'd usually make dinner, have a few beers, and enjoy the quiet. Coming from my apartment in Knoxville, the silence was a nice change. The night it happened was a Tuesday, I think. Mark had left for work, and I'd spent the evening watching some baseball on his fuzzy TV before deciding to have a cigarette on the porch before bed. It was probably around 10:30 or so when I stepped outside. The first thing I noticed was how still everything was. I mean, unnaturally still. Usually there'd be crickets chirping, maybe an owl hooting, the sound of leaves rustling in the breeze. But that night, nothing. Absolute silence. It felt like someone had dropped a glass dome over the whole property. The hair on my arms stood up immediately. I remember thinking that maybe a storm was coming, the way animals sometimes go quiet before bad weather hits. But the sky was clear. I could see stars everywhere. No clouds, no wind, just this eerie stillness that made my skin crawl. I was about halfway through my cigarette when I heard it. This loud, wet, snorting sound coming from near the small equipment shed by the tree line. The shed wasn't much, just an 8x10 metal building where Mark kept his riding mower and tools. The sound was deep and powerful, like something big forcing air through its nose. Not like a horse or cow, something bigger with more force behind it. I froze mid-drag, the cigarette burning away between my fingers. A few seconds passed, and then another snort, just as loud as the first. Then another, like whatever was making the sound was doing it at regular intervals. My first thought was maybe a bear had wandered onto the property, though I'd never heard a bear make a sound quite like that. After the fourth or fifth snort, I quietly stubbed out my cigarette and slipped back inside the trailer. I grabbed the big mag light from the kitchen drawer, the heavy aluminum kind that could double as a weapon if needed. I didn't have a gun, and Mark kept his locked up somewhere I didn't know about. Looking back, I should have just locked the doors, turned off the lights, and waited until morning. But there's something about not knowing that's worse than knowing, even when the truth is terrifying. So I stepped back outside, flashlight gripped tight in my sweaty palm. I kept the beam pointed down at first, not wanting to startle whatever was out there. The snorting had stopped, but that silence was still hanging over everything. I moved slowly down the 3 porch steps and started making my way toward the shed, staying on the gravel path. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. When I got about 20 feet from the shed, I heard a subtle shifting sound, like something heavy adjusting its weight. I froze again, straining to see in the darkness. The moonlight only showed the outline of the shed, with the woods behind it, just a wall of black. I took a deep breath and raised the flashlight, aiming it toward the back corner of the shed where I thought the sound had come from. What I saw in that beam of light is burned into my memory forever. Behind the shed, partially hidden by the corner, was something massive. The light only caught part of it, a shoulder, an arm, and part of its back. It was covered in long, dark hair, not like fur exactly, more matted and coarse, with bits of leaves, grass, and what looked like dried mud tangled in it. The hair was maybe 4 or 5 inches long, and where it thinned out near what I assumed was its shoulder, I could see skin underneath that looked dark, almost grayish-brown. I couldn't move. I couldn't breathe. I stood there, flashlight trembling in my hand, as my brain tried desperately to categorize what I was seeing. Not a bear, not a person in a costume, not anything I'd ever seen before. Then it moved. Just slightly, but enough that I could tell it was turning its head toward me. I started backing up slowly, keeping the light trained on that patch of hair and skin. That's when it rose up. It stood in one smooth motion, unfolding from its crouched position until it was at its full height. Taller than the shed, which had to be at least 7 feet. The shoulders were extraordinarily wide, maybe 3 feet across, with a thick chest and arms that hung down past its waist. The proportions were all wrong for a human, too big, too powerful looking. As it turned fully toward me, the light caught its face. The facial skin had less hair, darker than the rest of its body. The eyes caught the flashlight beam and reflected slightly, not like a deer's would, but enough to show they were fixed directly on me. Its nose was flat and wide, and its lips were pressed tightly together. There was intelligence in that face, not animal awareness, but something that understood exactly what it was looking at. For what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, we just stared at each other. Then it exhaled forcefully through its nose. That same wet snorting sound I'd heard earlier. In the cool night air, I could see a cloud of steam come from its nostrils. That broke my paralysis. I dropped the flashlight and ran. I don't remember the sprint back to the trailer, just the sound of my own panicked breathing and the feel of the door handle as I yanked it open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut. I locked it, then pushed a chair against it for good measure. I spent the rest of the night sitting at the kitchen table in complete darkness. I was too terrified to turn on a light, convinced it would attract whatever was out there. Every creak, every subtle sound made me jump. What kept cycling through my mind was how it had shown no fear, no aggression either, just this calm observation, like it was studying me. When dawn finally broke, I was still sitting there, stiff and exhausted. I waited until the sun was fully up before working up the courage to go outside. The flashlight was still where I'd dropped it, still on, the batteries nearly dead. The beam was so weak I could barely see it in the morning light. What I could see, though, were the tracks. Large impressions in the dirt and leaves around the shed, each about 18 to 20 inches long with visible toes. They led from the tree line to the shed and then back into the woods. I followed them to the edge of the trees, but couldn't bring myself to go any further. I spent the day in a daze, jumping at every sound, constantly looking toward the woods. When Mark came home on Friday morning after his night shift, I tried to act normal, but eventually broke down and told him everything. His reaction surprised me. He wasn't shocked or disbelieving. He just nodded slowly and said, "Yeah, I've heard things out there too. Seen shadows moving between the trees sometimes. Never got a clear look though. I stayed one more night, but I couldn't sleep. Every sound from outside made my heart race." The next morning, I packed my stuff and left, making up some excuse about a work emergency. Mark didn't push it. I think he understood. I've never gone back to that property. Mark sold it a few years later and moved closer to town. We don't talk about what happened, but sometimes, when we've had a few beers, he'll give me this look, and I know he's thinking about it too. To this day, I can't explain what I saw. It wasn't a bear, wasn't a person, wasn't anything that should exist in the Tennessee woods. But it was there, watching me with those intelligent eyes, showing neither fear nor aggression. Just this disturbing, confident curiosity, like it knew exactly what I was, while I'm still trying to figure out what it was. Sometimes when I'm alone at night and everything gets too quiet, I find myself listening for that wet, snorting sound, and I wonder if somewhere in those woods it remembers me too. Story 5. I still get a pit in my stomach whenever I think about what happened that day. It's been over 5 years now, but I remember every detail like it was yesterday. I've told a few close friends, but most people just give me that look, you know the one, like I'm either making it up or I need medication. So I figured I'd share it here since you guys might actually believe me. It was early October 2018, a Wednesday, I think. The leaves were just starting to change, and we'd had this perfect stretch of fall weather, cool but not cold, dry, just amazing for mountain biking. I'm pretty serious about my riding and was training for a race that was coming up in November. I live about 15 minutes outside Portage-la Prairie, Manitoba. There's this network of trails through the woods that most locals don't even know about. Nothing official, just paths that riders like me have carved out over the years. I'd been riding there for almost a decade and knew every route and turn by heart. That day I got off work early, around 3 in the afternoon, and decided to squeeze in a quick training session before sunset. I brought my dog, Bruno. He's a shepherd lab mix, about 70 pounds, super athletic. Bruno always came with me on rides. He loved running alongside my bike, and he's a great trail dog. Stays close, doesn't chase wildlife, all that good stuff. The trail system starts about a mile from my house. I park my truck at this little clearing that serves as an unofficial trailhead. There's never anyone else there on weekdays, which is exactly how I like it. I unloaded my bike, put Bruno's orange visibility vest on him, hunting season was starting soon, and we headed out. It was around 4 o'clock when we hit the trails. The sun was still up but getting lower, casting these long shadows through the trees. The first 20 minutes were perfect. I was making good time, Bruno was keeping pace, and I was feeling strong. I'd been pushing hard on a section we riders call the spine, a narrow ridge with steep drops on both sides that runs for about a quarter mile. When I reached the end of the spine, there's this spot where the trail opens into a small clearing before diving back into denser woods. I always stopped there to catch my breath and let Bruno get a drink from his collapsible water bowl. I remember checking my watch. It was 4:23, and figuring I had time for the North Loop before I'd need to head back. That's when I saw it. About 50 yards ahead, just where the trail re-enters the trees, I noticed what looked like a dirty white blanket hanging from a bush. At first, I thought someone had dumped trash, which pissed me off because these trails are pristine, but then the blanket moved. I squinted, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. The shape unfolded and stood up. It had been squatting with its back toward me, and now it was turning around. My brain couldn't process what I was looking at. It was, I don't even know how to describe it properly. It was a creature, standing upright on 2 legs, covered in this dirty white or light grayish hair, not fur like a bear, hair thick and matted in places. It had this weird sloped head that seemed to sit directly on its shoulders with hardly any neck visible. The thing was massive, not super tall, maybe 6 feet or so, but thick, built like a power lifter with these wide shoulders and a barrel chest. Its arms hung down at its sides, longer than a human's but not dragging on the ground like an ape's. They were just proportionally wrong. For maybe 2 seconds it looked right at me. I couldn't make out its face clearly from that distance, but I could feel it watching me. Then, with just a couple of strides, it disappeared into the trees. It didn't run exactly, but it moved fast, way faster than something that size should be able to move. 2 steps, and it was gone. The whole encounter lasted maybe 5 seconds. I sat there on my bike, completely frozen. My heart was pounding so hard I could hear it in my ears. What freaked me out, almost as much as seeing the creature, was Bruno's reaction, or lack of one. This dog goes ballistic if he so much as smells a squirrel. He once spotted a black bear from 100 yards away and barked his head off. But with this thing, nothing. He just stood there, alert but calm, staring in the same direction. After what felt like forever but was probably only a minute, I snapped out of it. My first instinct was to get the hell out of there, but then curiosity kicked in. I'm not the type to believe in monsters or cryptids or whatever. I figured there had to be a logical explanation. "Bruno, stay close," I whispered, and we slowly moved forward along the trail. I kept my eyes locked on the spot where the creature had disappeared. The logical part of my brain was saying it must have been a bear standing on its hind legs, but I knew that wasn't right. Bears don't stand and walk like that, and they're definitely not white. When we reached the spot where I'd seen it, I got off my bike and looked around. The ground was mostly covered with fallen leaves and pine needles, so I couldn't see any tracks. I scanned the underbrush for broken branches or hair caught on twigs, but found nothing. It was like the thing had never been there. Bruno was acting completely normal, sniffing around like he always did, not showing any signs of fear or even interest in what had just happened. That bothered me more than anything. If it had been a bear or even a person in a costume, Bruno would have reacted. I stood there for maybe 5 minutes, searching for any evidence, before deciding to bail on the rest of my ride. I wasn't exactly scared, more unsettled and confused. I pedaled back to my truck faster than usual, constantly looking over my shoulder. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying those few seconds in my mind, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. I Googled white bear Manitoba and albino moose and every other large mammal I could think of, but nothing matched what I'd seen. Eventually, I found myself on websites about Sasquatch sightings, which made me feel ridiculous. I'd always thought Bigfoot was bullshit, just stories made up by attention seekers or confused hunters. But the more I read, the more I found descriptions that matched what I'd seen, except for the color. Most Sasquatch reports describe dark brown or black creatures, not white ones. Over the next few weeks, I went back to those trails several times, always bringing my GoPro and a better camera. I even brought a tape measure and plaster casting kit I ordered online, hoping to find footprints. I never saw the creature again, and never found any physical evidence it had been there. After a while, I started to question my own memory. Maybe it had been a bear, and my mind just played tricks on me. Maybe I was working too hard and not getting enough sleep. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the whole thing. Then, about a year later, I was at a local bar watching a hockey game. I got talking to this guy, Mike, who mentioned he was a hunter. When he said he hunted in the area near my trails, I casually asked if he'd ever seen anything unusual out there. "Funny you should ask," he said, lowering his voice. "Last fall, I saw something I still can't explain. Thought it was a bear at first, but it was walking on two legs, like a white gorilla or something. My blood ran cold. I asked him to describe it in detail, being careful not to lead him or mention what I'd seen. He described a creature about 8 feet tall, taller than what I'd seen, but he'd admitted he'd only glimpsed it from a distance, covered in dirty white hair, with a powerful build and a weird gait, like it was leaning forward when it walked. Two people seeing the same bizarre creature independently in the same area, that couldn't be coincidence. Whatever I saw that day was real. I've been back to those trails hundreds of times since then. I still mountain bike there regularly, still bring Bruno, though he's getting older now and can't keep up like he used to. I've never seen the white creature again, but I'm always looking, always aware that something unexplainable might be watching from the trees. The thing that sticks with me most isn't the creature's appearance, though that was definitely unsettling. It's the way it just stood up, looked at me, and left. It wasn't aggressive or threatening. It seemed almost as surprised to see me as I was to see it. Like we were two beings who weren't supposed to cross paths, suddenly finding ourselves face to face. Sometimes I think about going public with my story, bringing researchers to the area, or setting up trail cameras. But then I remember how I would have reacted to someone telling this story before it happened to me. I would have thought they were crazy or looking for attention. So I keep it mostly to myself, and now to you guys. I don't know what that thing was. Some undiscovered species, a Sasquatch with unusual coloring, something else entirely. All I know is that it was real, it exists, and it's out there somewhere in those woods. And every time I ride those trails, especially when I pass that clearing, I can't help but scan the trees, wondering if the white creature is watching me from the shadows. Story 6. I've spent my whole life trying to forget what happened in the Idaho wilderness that winter. I've never written about it before, but with age creeping up on me, I need someone to know the truth. I'm still haunted by what I saw, and I still wake up sometimes thinking I can smell that awful stench again. This happened back in 1842. I was 32 years old then, working as a fur trapper with my partner, John Miller. We'd been working together for about 3 years by then, moving through the territories between the Salmon River and the Wisdom River in Idaho. It was good country for beaver, and we'd had a profitable season that year. John was a quiet man, good with his hands, and even better with a rifle. He wasn't much for talking, which suited me fine since we spent months at a time with just each other for company. We had a good arrangement. He was better at skinning. I was better at setting the traps. We shared everything equally and never had any serious disagreements. I still think about him every day. It was early December, and we'd set up a semi-permanent camp in a small valley nestled between two steep ridges. The weather had been harsh, but manageable, and we'd built ourselves a sturdy lean-to with pine branches and canvas. We had about 2 dozen beaver pelts already cured, and a good stock of provisions that should have lasted us through winter. The trouble started on a Tuesday. I remember because John had been keeping track of the days in a small journal he carried. We'd spent the day checking our trap lines along a nearby creek and had caught 3 beavers, a good day's work. We skinned them on site and packed the pelts to bring back to camp. When we arrived back at camp just before sunset, something was wrong. Our lean-to was still standing, but everything else was in complete disarray. Our packs had been torn open, provisions scattered everywhere. Our carefully stacked pelts were thrown about, some damaged beyond repair. At first I thought it might have been a bear, but it was December. Any sensible bear would have been hibernating by then. "What the hell happened here?" John muttered, the first words he'd spoken all day. We searched the area and found tracks unlike any I'd ever seen in my years in the wilderness. They were enormous, easily twice the size of a man's footprint, but shaped all wrong. They looked almost human-like, but the toes were too long, splayed out in a way that made my skin crawl. And they were deep in the frozen ground, suggesting whatever made them was incredibly heavy. We spent an hour putting our camp back in order, salvaging what food hadn't been ruined. Neither of us said much, but I could tell John was as disturbed as I was. That night, we loaded our rifles and kept them close as we tried to sleep. I'd just drifted off when the attack came. Something large crashed into the side of our lean-to, nearly collapsing it. The smell hit me first, a wild, rank odor like rotting meat mixed with wet fur, but worse, so much worse. It was overwhelming, making my eyes water and my stomach turn. I grabbed my rifle and fired in the direction of the noise without really aiming. John was up too, shouting and firing his own gun. Whatever it was, let out a sound I'll never forget. Not quite a roar, not quite a scream, but something in between that seemed to pierce right through me. Then we heard it crashing away through the underbrush. We didn't sleep again that night. We kept the fire blazing high and talked about what to do. John thought it might be some kind of rogue bear, though he couldn't explain why it would be active in winter. I wasn't convinced. Those tracks didn't look like any bear I'd ever seen. When morning came, we found more tracks around our camp. They circled our lean-to completely, as if the creature had been studying us. There were claw marks on trees surrounding our camp at a height that would put the creature at nearly 8 feet tall. "We should move camp," John suggested. "Find somewhere more defensible." I agreed, but we had trap lines to check first. We couldn't afford to lose our equipment, not in the middle of winter with no way to replace it. We agreed to check the nearest lines, then return and pack up to move elsewhere. That was our mistake. When we returned to camp that afternoon, it had been destroyed again. But this time, it was different. This time, it felt deliberate. Our lean-to had been completely torn apart. The pelts we'd spent months collecting were shredded beyond repair. Our food supplies were gone. Not just scattered, but taken. Even more disturbing, our personal effects had been handled. John's journal was open, pages torn out and strewn about. My father's old pocket watch, which I kept wrapped in oilcloth at the bottom of my pack, was sitting in the middle of what remained of our fire pit. It felt like a message. That night, we made a much smaller camp about a mile away, up against a rock face, so nothing could come at us from behind. We decided to take turns keeping watch. I took the first shift while John tried to rest. About midnight I heard it. From the hill opposite our position came a low, grating moan that raised the hair on my neck. It wasn't an animal sound I recognized. It was almost deliberate, like it was trying to communicate something. The moaning continued for nearly an hour, sometimes quieter, sometimes louder, always unsettling. When I woke John for his watch, I told him what I'd heard. His face went grim in the firelight. "I think we need to leave this valley entirely," he said. "First light tomorrow. We pack what we can and go." I nodded. "What about the rest of our traps?" "Not worth our lives," he said simply. "We can come back in spring, maybe with more men." The next morning, we divided tasks. John would head back to what remained of our main camp and salvage anything useful for the journey out. I would retrieve the traps from the nearest creek. They were valuable and we couldn't afford to lose them all. "Meet back here in 3 hours," John said. "No matter what, if one of us doesn't show, the other doesn't wait." Those were the last words he ever spoke to me. I spent 2 hours collecting traps. It was hard work in the cold, my fingers going numb despite my gloves. I kept looking over my shoulder, feeling watched. Once, I thought I caught a glimpse of something large, moving between trees on the ridge above me, but when I raised my rifle to look through the sight, it was gone. I returned to our meeting point a little early, but John wasn't there. I waited, watching the sun move across the sky. When an hour had passed beyond our agreed meeting time, I knew something was wrong. John was many things, but never late. I should have left. That's what we'd agreed, but I couldn't leave without knowing. I made my way cautiously back to our original campsite. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up long before I reached it. That smell was back. That horrible, rank odor that seemed to hang in the air like a fog. I found John about 20 yards from the camp. He was lying face down in the snow, which was stained dark red around him. I approached slowly, rifle ready, scanning the trees. When I turned him over, I nearly vomited. His neck had been broken, twisted at an impossible angle so that his head faced almost completely backward. But worse were the marks on his throat, 4 puncture wounds, evenly spaced, like fangs had sunk deep into his flesh. His eyes were open, frozen in an expression of pure terror. The tracks told the rest of the story. The creature had come from behind, striking with such force that John's body had been literally thrown several feet through the air. His rifle was still slung over his shoulder, unfired. I didn't bury him. God forgive me, but I didn't. Fear overtook me completely. I ran back to where we'd left our horses tethered, grabbed my pony, and rode out of that valley as fast as the animal could carry me. I left everything behind. All our traps, the remaining pelts, our supplies, everything except my rifle and what I could fit in my saddlebags. I rode for 2 days straight, only stopping when my horse couldn't go any further. I made it to a trading post on the edge of the territory and told them there had been an accident, that John had fallen. I couldn't bring myself to tell the truth. Who would believe me? In the years since, I've heard stories from other trappers and hunters about the Idaho territories. Strange stories about men gone missing, camps destroyed, enormous tracks found in remote areas. Some call it Sasquatch or Bigfoot. The Indians have their own names for it. I don't know what it was that killed John. I only know that it was intelligent, powerful, and malevolent. It didn't just kill him, it wanted us to know it could kill us. It was playing with us first. I never returned to trapping after that winter. I took work as a blacksmith's assistant in a small town far from the mountains. I married, had children, lived a normal life. But I've never forgotten, and I've never gone back into deep wilderness alone. Sometimes, when the wind blows just right, I still catch a whiff of something that reminds me of that awful smell. And I wonder if it's still out there, waiting in the Idaho mountains. Story 7. I've been debating whether to share this for almost 30 years now. My wife says I should just let it go, but the memory of what happened that day in September of 1993 still keeps me up at night sometimes. I'm not crazy, I wasn't drunk, and I definitely wasn't hallucinating. What I saw was real, and I need to get this off my chest. It was supposed to be just a normal family hike. Me, my wife Linda, our son Kevin, who was 32 at the time, and my brother Dave decided to spend the weekend hiking near Snoqualmie Pass in Washington. We'd done this trail a few times before, nothing too challenging, just a nice 6-mile loop with some beautiful views of the surrounding forest. The weather was perfect that day. Not too hot, not too cold, with just a light breeze rustling through the trees. We'd started out early that morning, around 7 or so. Linda had packed us all sandwiches and some trail mix, and Dave brought his fancy new camera to take pictures of the landscape. Kevin was going through a rough patch at work and needed to clear his head, so we thought the hike would do him good. Everything was completely normal for the first couple hours of the hike. We spotted a few deer in the distance, saw an eagle soaring overhead, and Kevin even found some interesting mushrooms growing alongside the trail, just your average hike in the Pacific Northwest. By around 11 in the morning, we'd reached a section of the trail that cuts along a rocky ridge. On one side, there was this steep wall of rock and scree, and on the other, a fairly sharp drop-off into dense forest. The trail itself was only about 4 feet wide at this point. Linda was getting a bit tired, so we decided to take a break. We found a relatively flat section of the trail where we could all sit comfortably without being too close to the edge. Dave was snapping pictures of the valley below, while I broke out some water bottles from my backpack. That's when I first noticed something felt off. It took me a minute to realize what it was. The forest had gotten weirdly quiet. No birds chirping, no squirrels rustling around in the underbrush. Even the breeze seemed to have died down. I remember looking at Kevin and seeing that he had noticed it too. He was staring into the forest below us with this confused expression on his face. "You hear that?" he asked quietly. "Hear what?" Linda replied. "Exactly, nothing." Dave lowered his camera and frowned. "Huh. That's weird." I was about to suggest we keep moving when Kevin suddenly tensed up and pointed down into the trees. "There's something moving down there." At first I couldn't see anything. The forest was thick with pines and undergrowth, creating deep shadows even in the middle of the day. But then I saw it too. Movement between the trees, about 50 yards down the slope. Something big was pushing through the vegetation. "Probably just a deer," Linda said, but there was uncertainty in her voice. We all knew deer don't move like that. This was something heavy, deliberately pushing branches aside as it moved. None of us said anything for what felt like an eternity. We just watched, frozen in place, as whatever it was down there moved parallel to the trail. Then it stopped. I remember thinking maybe it was a bear and we should quietly back away, but something kept me rooted to the spot. Some primal instinct told me this wasn't a bear, and then it stepped forward, partially emerging from the tree line, and my entire understanding of the world changed in an instant. The thing standing there was enormous, at least 9 feet tall, maybe more. It was covered in dark, shaggy hair, a mix of deep brown and black that seemed to absorb the sunlight rather than reflect it. But what struck me most was how human-like it was, despite being clearly not human at all. It stood upright on 2 legs, with impossibly long arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its chest was massively broad, and its legs were like tree trunks. The head sat low on powerful shoulders, almost as if it didn't have much of a neck at all. I couldn't breathe. My heart was hammering so hard I could feel it in my throat. Next to me, I heard Linda make a small whimpering sound, and I felt her hand grip my arm so tightly it hurt. Dave had gone completely pale, and Kevin looked like he was about to be sick. The creature, I knew instantly it was a Sasquatch, though I'd never believed in them before, took another step forward, and I watched in disbelief as a sapling about as thick as my wrist snapped under its foot like it was nothing more than a twig. The sound of it breaking echoed through the silent forest like a gunshot. Now I could see its face more clearly. It had deep-set eyes under a heavy brow ridge, a wide, flat nose and a mouth that seemed too wide for its face. Those eyes, they weren't animal eyes. There was intelligence there, awareness. It was studying us, taking in each of our faces one by one, assessing us. I don't know how long we stood there staring at each other. Time seemed to stretch and warp. All I know is that at some point, the creature opened its mouth and made a sound I'll never forget as long as I live. It wasn't a roar or a scream. It was deeper than that, a sort of rumbling growl that started low and built in intensity until it seemed to vibrate the air around us. The sound carried across the trees and echoed back from the ridge behind us, surrounding us completely. My legs were shaking so badly I thought I might collapse. The creature was now standing partially on the trail ahead of us, effectively blocking our path forward. It wasn't aggressive, at least not overtly, but the message was clear. We weren't welcome to continue. "We need to go back," I whispered, my voice barely audible even to myself. "Slowly. Don't run." Nobody argued. With our eyes still locked on the Sasquatch, we began to back away, one tiny step at a time. Dave was in front, then Linda, then Kevin, with me bringing up the rear. I couldn't take my eyes off the creature. Its gaze followed us, unwavering. Those intelligent eyes tracking our every movement. We backed up for what must have been 100 yards before the trail curved around the ridge and the creature finally disappeared from view. Even then, none of us turned around. We kept backing up for another few minutes before Kevin finally spoke. "Is it following us?" I strained to listen but heard nothing. "I don't think so," I said, though I wasn't sure. Only then did we finally turn around and start walking normally. Though normally is probably the wrong word. We were practically jogging, stealing glances over our shoulders every few seconds. Nobody spoke. We just pushed on, desperate to put as much distance between ourselves and that thing as possible. We hiked non-stop for 2 hours, not even pausing for water. My legs were burning, and Linda was struggling to keep up. But fear is one hell of a motivator. Every snapping twig, every rustle of leaves sent a jolt of adrenaline through my body. By the time we finally reached our car in the parking lot, we were exhausted, dehydrated, and still terrified. Dave was the first to break the silence as we collapsed into the car. "What the actual hell was that?" Nobody answered immediately. What could we say? We all knew what we'd seen, but saying it out loud seemed impossible. "It was a Sasquatch," Kevin finally said, his voice hollow. "A goddamn Bigfoot." Linda started crying then, not out of fear, but from the sheer release of tension. I just sat there behind the wheel, my hands shaking too badly to put the key in the ignition. The drive home was mostly silent. We tried to process what we'd experienced, but how do you process something that shouldn't exist? At one point, Dave suggested we report it to someone, but who? The park rangers? The police? We'd be laughed out of the building. Besides, part of me didn't want to tell anyone. That section of forest, that trail, it belonged to the creature now. I didn't want hordes of people tramping through there trying to find it, disturbing it. When we got home, we made a pact not to talk about it outside the family. Who would believe us anyway? But the four of us knew what we saw. There was no mistaking it. The creature's massive frame, the visible muscles rippling beneath its hair as it moved, those extraordinarily long arms ending in thick fingers, the deliberate, intelligent way it behaved. It wasn't an animal, at least not in the way we think of animals. It was something else entirely. I've spent years trying to rationalize what happened that day. Maybe it was a bear standing on its hind legs. No, bears don't look anything like what we saw. A man in a suit. Impossible. No human could be that large or move that way in the dense undergrowth. The costume would have snagged on everything. The truth is, I know what I saw. We all do. That creature was real, and it was establishing its territory. It could have easily chased us down if it wanted to. We were completely at its mercy, but it chose to simply warn us away instead. I haven't been back to that trail since. None of us have. But I still think about that day all the time. I still see those intelligent eyes studying us, still hear that deep rumbling growl that seemed to come from the earth itself. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, patrolling its territory, occasionally crossing paths with other hikers who, like us, suddenly find themselves face to face with something impossible. I don't expect anyone to believe me. I wouldn't believe it either if I hadn't seen it with my own eyes. But it happened. And now, nearly 30 years later, I still can't explain it. All I know is that there are things in this world we don't understand, things that defy explanation. And sometimes, if you're really unlucky, you come face to face with them on what should have been just an ordinary hike on an ordinary day in September. Story 8. Back in mid-August 2003, my buddy Jake and I decided to do a weekend backpacking trip in the Olympic rainforest in Washington. We weren't newbies. I'd been backpacking since I was 15, and Jake was basically raised in the woods by his dad, who worked for the Forest Service. We'd done plenty of remote hikes together before. We picked a trail that branched off an old logging road, one that wasn't on most tourist maps. We wanted solitude, you know, get away from the regular campgrounds where you can hear people partying 2 sites over. The trailhead was already pretty remote. We had to take Jake's Jeep down this washed-out Forest Service road for like 40 minutes just to reach it. We hiked about 7 miles in that Friday afternoon. The trail wasn't maintained great, lots of overgrowth and fallen trees to climb over, but that's what we wanted, somewhere truly away from everything. We found this perfect little clearing next to a stream, nestled between these massive old-growth trees. Real Pacific Northwest postcard stuff. We set up the tent, cooked some freeze-dried meals on the camp stove, hung our food bag from a tree branch, standard bear precaution, and were in our sleeping bags by 10. I remember waking up suddenly and checking my watch. It was around 1:30 in the morning. At first, I wasn't sure what had woken me, but then I heard it, this heavy thudding sound coming from somewhere in the forest. Not close, but not super far either, like something big moving through the underbrush. "Jake," I whispered, "you awake?" "Yeah," he whispered back. "You hear that?" We both lay there listening. The sound was rhythmic, thud, 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 but slow, deliberate. Not like a deer or something small. This was heavy. And it was getting closer. "Probably just a black bear," Jake said, but I could hear the uncertainty in his voice. "I've encountered black bears before. They usually crash through the underbrush like drunk teenagers, snapping twigs and rustling everything. This was different, more purposeful, more controlled." The thudding stopped, and the forest went completely silent. No insects, no night birds, nothing. Just dead silence. That's when I really started getting freaked out. Anyone who spends time in forests knows that sudden silence is never a good sign. Jake unzipped the tent a few inches and peeked out. The moon was nearly full that night, so there was decent visibility. "I don't see anything," he whispered, "but something's definitely out there." Then it happened. This scream. I don't even know how to describe it. It wasn't human, wasn't a bear, wasn't a cougar, and I've heard all of those before. This was deeper, more powerful, almost like it came from something with a massive chest cavity. It started low and then rose in pitch, lasting for what felt like forever, but was probably only 5 or 6 seconds. My blood went cold. Jake zipped the tent back up so fast he nearly broke the zipper. We just stared at each other in the dim light, not saying a word. Before we could even process what we'd heard, another scream answered the first one, from a different direction and closer to our camp. That's when I realized we were between them, whatever they were. "What the actual fuck was that?" I finally managed to say. Jake just shook his head. "I don't know, man. I've never heard anything like it." We sat there frozen, listening. The forest was still completely silent, no normal night sounds at all. Then we heard movement again, closer this time, just beyond the clearing where we'd set up camp, branches snapping, underbrush being pushed aside. Something big was circling our campsite. That's when the first rock hit. It landed maybe 10 feet from our tent with a heavy thud. Not like a pebble that might have been kicked up by an animal. This was a proper fist-sized rock that had clearly been thrown. "That's not an animal," Jake whispered. "Animals don't throw rocks." A second rock landed, closer this time, then a third. They were being thrown from the tree line surrounding our clearing, and they were definitely aimed in our direction. I've been around enough drunk idiots to know when someone's messing with you. Maybe some locals are screwing with us, I suggested, but even as I said it, I knew that made no sense. We were 7 miles from the nearest road, in an area most locals wouldn't even know about. After about the 5th rock, Jake grabbed his flashlight, one of those heavy-duty mag lights, and unzipped the tent again. He shined the beam toward where the last rock had come from. I'll never forget the sound he made. This choked gasp, like all the air had been squeezed from his lungs. He dropped back into the tent, zipping it closed again. "There's something out there," he said, his voice shaking, standing upright, covered in hair, fucking huge. "A bear?" I asked, desperately wanting him to say yes. "No way," he said. It was standing on 2 legs, between those 2 big cedars. When the light hit it, it moved back behind the tree. Fast. My mind was racing, trying to make sense of what was happening. Bears do occasionally stand on their hind legs, but they don't throw rocks, and they definitely don't make sounds like what we'd heard. For the next 30 minutes, we sat in terror as more rocks landed around our tent. Some hit with enough force that I was afraid they'd tear through the fabric, and the footsteps, heavy footsteps, circled our camp from all sides, not just from one direction, but from multiple points around us. Whatever was out there, there was more than one of them. Around 2:45, we heard 2 more of those ungodly screams, from different directions. The first was farther away, maybe from where we'd heard the original scream. The second was much closer, maybe 100 yards from our tent. They were communicating, coordinating. I'd been backpacking in remote areas for over a decade at that point, and I'd never been so terrified. The complete violation of everything I understood about wildlife behavior had me questioning my sanity. Animals don't throw rocks. They don't coordinate to intimidate. They don't surround a camp and systematically terrorize its occupants. Eventually, the footsteps seemed to move away. The forest was still unnaturally quiet, but the immediate sense of threat diminished somewhat. Neither of us slept. We just sat there, backs against each other, listening to every sound until the first hint of dawn appeared. As soon as it was light enough to see, we packed up camp faster than we ever had before. We didn't cook breakfast, didn't filter water, just stuffed everything into our packs and got the hell out of there. The hike back was unsettling in a completely different way. We kept seeing signs of disturbance that neither of us had noticed on the way in. Branches broken high up in the trees, much higher than a person could reach. Tree bark with these long, deep scratch marks. Areas where the underbrush had been completely flattened, like something large had bedded down. And the whole time, I couldn't shake the feeling we were being watched. Every few minutes, I'd spin around, certain I'd catch something following us, but there was never anything visible. Just that overwhelming sense of eyes on us. Jake saw it too. I could tell by how he kept looking over his shoulder, how he flinched at every sound. We barely spoke during that 7-mile hike back, just pushed ourselves to move as quickly as possible over the rough terrain. When we finally reached the Jeep, I nearly cried with relief. We threw our packs in the back, and Jake fumbled with the keys, his hands shaking so badly he could barely get them in the ignition. As we pulled away, I looked back toward the trailhead one last time. I swear I saw movement just inside the tree line, something large shifting position, pulling back into the shadows. We drove in silence for about 20 minutes before Jake finally spoke. "We don't tell anyone about this," he said. "They'll think we're crazy." I agreed. What could we even say? That we were harassed by multiple Bigfoot? That sounds insane even typing it out now. But I know what I experienced. I know what I heard. Those screams, those coordinated movements, the rocks thrown with obvious intent. None of that fits with any known wildlife behavior. Jake and I went our separate ways a few months later when he moved to Colorado for work. We've only spoken a handful of times since then, and we never directly discuss what happened. But last year, he called me out of the blue at like 2 in the morning. "You still think about it?" he asked without preamble. "Yeah," I said. "All the time." "Me too," he said, and then hung up. "I haven't been backpacking since that trip, not once in 20 years. I still go hiking, but only on popular trails, and I'm always back to my car before sunset. I can't bring myself to spend another night in the deep woods. I know how this all sounds. I know the logical explanations people will offer. Bears, territorial hunters, my imagination running wild. But I know what I experienced. Those weren't human footsteps. Those weren't human screams. And whatever watched us from the forest that night wasn't anything I can explain, even all these years later. Sometimes I still wake up in the middle of the night, thinking I hear rocks hitting the side of my house. And in those moments, I'm right back there in that tent, realizing there are things in this world that don't fit into the neat categories we've created to help us feel safe. Story 9. I still get chills talking about this, even though it's been almost 18 years now. This happened back in June of 2006 on Lake Ouachita in Arkansas. My buddy Derek and I had been planning this fishing trip for weeks. We're both pretty experienced outdoorsmen, and we'd heard the night fishing on Ouachita was incredible that time of year. We got to the Joplin Recreation Area boat ramp around 7 in the evening. The sun was still up, but starting to sink behind the trees. It was hot as hell that day, must have been close to 95 degrees, and the humidity made everything feel sticky. I remember sweating through my shirt, just loading our gear into Derek's 14-foot aluminum boat. We packed light, just our fishing gear, a cooler with some beers and sandwiches, and our headlamps for when it got dark. I should mention I'd done 4 years in the Marines before this and spent plenty of time in the wilderness. I've been hunting since I was 12, fishing even longer. I'm not someone who spooks easily or mistakes natural sounds for something they're not. Derek's the same way, level-headed guy who works construction and spends most weekends outdoors. The lake was pretty quiet that evening. A few boats were heading back in as we were heading out, but by the time we got to our spot, we had that section of the lake to ourselves. We motored out to this small island about 20 minutes from the boat ramp. I can't remember the name of it now, but it was dense with pine trees and had a rocky shoreline, perfect spot for bass fishing as the sun goes down. We caught a few decent-sized fish over the next couple hours. Nothing spectacular, but enough to keep us interested. As it got darker, we switched on our headlamps and kept at it. The night was clear, with a 3/4 moon providing decent visibility on the water. There was a light breeze, just enough to keep the mosquitoes away, and the water was calm with gentle ripples. Around 10 o'clock, we were about 30 yards offshore from this island when I heard the first splash. It was distinct, not like a fish jumping, more like someone had thrown a rock into the water. I didn't think much of it at first. Maybe some campers on the island or another boat somewhere nearby that I couldn't see. "You hear that?" Derek asked, lowering his fishing rod. "Yeah, probably just someone camping out there," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, something felt off. The splash had come from the island, but we hadn't seen any tents or campfires when we'd circled it earlier. Then it happened again, a bigger splash this time, and definitely a rock, then another and another, each splash getting closer to our boat. "Someone's throwing rocks at us," Derek said, his voice tight. I aimed my headlamp toward the island but couldn't see anyone. The tree line was about 15 feet from the shore, dense pines casting deep shadows. "Hello?" I called out. "Anyone there?" No response, just another splash, this one landing maybe 10 feet from our boat. "Let's move," I said, reaching for the motor pull cord. That's when I saw it. At first, it was just a shape, darker than the shadows around it, standing next to a massive pine tree at the edge of the shoreline. As I focused my headlamp, I could make out more details, and my blood went cold. This thing was enormous, tall enough that its head was level with a branch that must have been at least 8 feet off the ground. It was standing upright on 2 legs, but it wasn't human. The proportions were all wrong. The shoulders were impossibly broad, I'd guess at least 4 feet across, and covered in what looked like dark, matted fur. Derek saw it too. "What the fuck?" he whispered, frozen in place. The creature stood motionless for a few seconds, just staring at us. I couldn't make out facial features clearly, but I could feel it watching us. My headlamp beam seemed to reflect slightly off its eyes, not the bright reflection you'd get from a deer or raccoon, but a dull reddish glow. Then it moved, and that's when true terror set in. In one fluid motion, it reached up, grabbed a branch from the pine tree and tore it off. Not a small branch either. This was a substantial limb. The crack of the wood breaking echoed across the water. "Start the motor," Derek hissed, his voice barely audible. My hands were shaking so badly I missed the pull cord on the first try. The creature began moving toward the shoreline, still clutching the broken branch. Its gait was smooth but strange. Longer strides than a human would take, with a slight sway to its upper body. On my second attempt, the motor sputtered to life. I cranked the throttle and we shot backward, away from the island. I didn't take my eyes off the shore until we were at least 100 yards away. The creature had stopped at the water's edge. It stood there watching us retreat, then flung the branch into the water with a force that sent it sailing at least 30 feet before it splashed down. We didn't stop until we were halfway across the lake, probably a quarter mile from the island. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. Derek and I just stared at each other, neither of us speaking for what felt like forever. "Tell me you saw that," I finally managed to say. Derek nodded, his face pale even in the moonlight. "What the hell was that thing?" "I don't know," I replied honestly. But it wasn't human. We sat there debating what to do. Part of me wanted to get off the lake immediately, but another part, the marine in me, I guess, wanted to understand what we'd just encountered. Derek was surprisingly calm once the initial shock wore off. "Could it have been a bear?" he suggested, but his tone made it clear he didn't believe that himself. "Bears don't stand that tall on their hind legs, and they sure as hell don't tear branches off trees to throw them," I said. We eventually decided to continue fishing, but moved to the opposite side of the lake. Neither of us wanted to call it quits and head back to the boat ramp, which would have meant passing close to that island again. In hindsight, that was probably stupid, but at the time it seemed safer to stay out on open water until daylight. We barely spoke for the next few hours. Every splash or rustle from the shoreline made us both tense up. We didn't catch any more fish. Around 2 in the morning, we pulled up to a different shore and just sat in the boat. Too wired to sleep, but too exhausted to keep fishing. We waited for dawn like that, taking turns keeping watch while the other tried to rest. As the sky began lightening around 5:30, we faced a decision. The logical thing would have been to head back to the boat ramp and get the hell out of there. But something, curiosity, stubbornness, or just plain stupidity, made us want to go back to the island in daylight. "We need to see what was really there," Derek said. "Otherwise we'll always wonder." I agreed, though every instinct was screaming at me to leave. We approached the island cautiously as the sun rose. It looked harmless in the morning light, just a small wooded island like dozens of others on the lake. We circled it once, seeing nothing unusual from the water, then decided to beach the boat and look around. I'll never forget the feeling of stepping onto that shoreline. Every muscle in my body was tense, ready to run at the slightest sound. We moved carefully, following the rocky beach to the spot where we'd seen the creature. It didn't take long to find evidence that something had been there. The pine tree stood just where I remembered, massive and old. About 8 feet up, there was a fresh break where a branch had been torn away. Not cut, not broken by wind or weather, torn. The wood was splintered and jagged with strips of bark peeled back. Derek and I just stared at it. I'm 6'1" and I could walk under that broken branch with room to spare. Whatever had removed it had to be at least 8 to 8.5 feet tall. "Look at this," Derek called from a few feet away. He was examining the branch itself, which had landed partway on the shore. It was huge, nearly 11 inches in diameter at the base. I tried to break a similar-sized branch from another tree and couldn't even make it budge. We continued searching the area and found more disturbing signs. Several saplings nearby had been twisted, not broken cleanly, but twisted almost in two, their fibers stretched and mangled. It looked deliberate, like something had been marking its territory. There were no tracks, though. The ground was too rocky and dry to hold footprints. We searched for about an hour, but found nothing else concrete. No hair, no clear evidence of what kind of creature had been there. As we prepared to leave, I noticed something that made my skin crawl. The island wasn't that big, maybe 2 acres at most, and we hadn't seen any other boats approach all morning. There was no sign of anyone camping there, no fire pit, no trash, nothing to suggest human presence. Whatever had thrown those rocks and torn that branch hadn't come from outside. It had been on that island the whole time. The ride back to the boat ramp was silent. We loaded up and drove home without discussing what we'd seen. It was almost like we both needed time to process it separately before we could talk about it. A few days later, Derek called me. "I've been doing some research," he said without preamble. "There have been other sightings around Lake Ouachita, hikers, campers, fishermen, all describing something similar." I wasn't surprised. What we'd seen felt ancient somehow, like something that had been there long before us and would remain long after. I've spent enough time in the wilderness to know there are things out there we don't understand. Since that night, I've gone back to Lake Ouachita many times, but never to that island and never after dark. I don't actively look for these creatures, what some people might call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, but I'm absolutely certain they exist. No human could have done what we witnessed, and no known animal fits what we saw. Sometimes I wake up in the middle of the night, the sound of that branch cracking replaying in my mind. I can still see those dull, reddish eyes reflecting in my headlamp beam. I can still feel the primal fear that washed over me when it started moving toward our boat. I don't know what would have happened if we hadn't gotten the motor started when we did. I don't want to know. Some things are better left unconfronted, some territories better left unmarked. All I know is what I saw that night changed my understanding of what exists in our world. And sometimes, when I'm fishing on a quiet lake at dusk, I find myself scanning the shoreline, watching the shadows between the trees, and wondering if I'm being watched in return. Story 10. I still get goosebumps thinking about what happened to me last month. It was early October, probably around the 7th or 8th. I remember because the fall colors were at their peak and I had a few days off work. I decided to take a drive through Duck Mountain Provincial Park to enjoy the autumn scenery. The weather was perfect that day, clear blue skies, around 55 degrees, with that crisp fall air that just smells like leaves and earth. I'd been driving for maybe 40 minutes on one of those winding dirt roads that cut through the park. You know the kind, not maintained great, but passable in my Subaru. The fallen leaves were scattered across the ground in this amazing mosaic of reds and golds. I wasn't in any hurry, probably going about 15 miles per hour, just taking it all in with my window cracked open a couple inches to feel the fresh air. That's when I heard it. A crashing sound in the woods to my left, like something big was moving through the underbrush. My first thought was moose, because they're common in the area, and I immediately slowed down. We've had a few car-moose collisions around here, and I didn't want to be another statistic. I came to a complete stop expecting to see an animal cross the road ahead. What happened next? I've replayed it in my mind 1,000 times, trying to convince myself I saw something else, anything else. But I know what I saw. About 10 feet in front of my car, this massive thing stepped out from the tree line. It wasn't a moose, it wasn't a bear. It was walking on 2 legs like a human, but it was definitely not human. It crossed the entire road in just 2 steps. 2. The road wasn't narrow either. It had to be at least 15 feet across. With each step, I could see dust rising from the gravel where its foot made contact. The creature never broke stride or changed its pace, just this purposeful, powerful movement straight across the road and into the woods on the other side. I sat there frozen, hands gripping the steering wheel so tight my knuckles turned white. My brain was struggling to process what I was seeing. The whole crossing probably lasted 3 seconds at most, but I caught every detail in this weird state of hyper-awareness. This thing was enormous. I'm 6 feet tall, and it towered over what my car height would be. Its shoulders had to be at least 3 feet across, broader than any bodybuilder I've ever seen. The build was just powerful. Massive chest and back that tapered to a narrower waist, but still thick. Nothing about it was lanky or thin. Its arms were proportionally longer than a human's, hanging down to around its knees, and they swung slightly as it walked. The creature was covered in hair, not fur exactly, but more like hair that varied in length. It was predominantly dark brown, almost black on the head and shoulders, with slightly lighter patches on its chest and legs. The hair wasn't matted or scraggly like you might imagine for a wild animal. It looked, I don't know, maintained? Natural. Its head looked almost small compared to the massive body, with a rounded top that sloped into what should have been a neck, except there barely was one. The head just kind of sat on those enormous shoulders. I caught a glimpse of its face as it crossed. It was darker than the rest of its body, not completely black, but a deep, shadowy brown. What struck me most were the eyes. They were large, and I could clearly see white around the irises. They weren't glowing or red or anything fantastical like that. They looked intelligent. That's the part that still shakes me. The creature never looked at me, never acknowledged my car or my presence in any way. It was like I didn't even register as something worth noting. It just continued its deliberate path through the woods, and within seconds, it had disappeared into the trees on the other side of the road. I sat there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two, my heart pounding in my ears. Part of me wanted to get the hell out of there, but another part, the part that couldn't believe what I'd just seen, made me put the car in park and get out. My legs were shaking as I approached the spot where it had crossed. The gravel was disturbed, but the ground was too hard-packed to show clear footprints. I stood there staring at the woods where it had disappeared, straining to hear any sound of its movement, but there was nothing, just the occasional bird call and the sound of leaves rustling in the light breeze. I don't know how long I stood there, maybe 5 minutes, maybe 15. Eventually, I got back in my car and just sat there, trying to process what I'd seen. I didn't have my phone out to take pictures. It all happened too fast, and honestly, I was too shocked to think about documentation. Now I wish I had some proof beyond my own memory. The drive home was a blur. I kept checking my mirrors, half expecting to see the creature following me or crossing the road again. My mind was racing, trying to rationalize what I'd witnessed. Could it have been a person in a costume? No way. The movement was too fluid, too natural, and no human could be that size without appearing bulky or awkward. A bear walking upright? Maybe, but bears don't walk on 2 legs for that distance, and the proportions were all wrong. When I got home, I immediately went online and started researching Sasquatch sightings in Duck Mountain. There were a few reports over the years, but nothing recent. I read about classic Bigfoot characteristics, the height, the stride length, the dark coloring, and it all matched what I saw. I'd never given much thought to Bigfoot before this. I wasn't a believer, but I wasn't a hardcore skeptic either. Now, I don't know what to think. The next day, I almost convinced myself I'd imagined it or somehow misinterpreted what I saw, but I know that's not true. The image is too clear in my mind. The way it moved, so powerful yet silent, no human moves like that. The sheer size and proportions aren't something you can mistake. It's been about 4 weeks now, and I still haven't told many people. My wife knows, and she believes me because she's never seen me this shaken up about anything before. I told one close friend who's into outdoor stuff, and he immediately wanted to go back to the spot with cameras and gear. I haven't taken him up on it yet. Part of me wants to know more, to have proof, but another part is, I don't know, respectful, afraid, maybe both. I've been back to Duck Mountain twice since then, driving the same road, hoping to see something, but also terrified of actually seeing it again. I've brought a decent camera with me both times, keeping it on the passenger seat ready to go. Nothing so far. The thing that keeps nagging at me is how deliberate its movement was. This wasn't a random animal wandering through the woods. It was going somewhere with purpose. It knew the area. It had a destination. And that makes me wonder, how many of these creatures are out there? Do they have territories, communities? Are they watching us more than we realize? I've always been a rational person. I work in IT, for God's sake. I deal with concrete problems and solutions every day. But this experience has opened up a world of questions I never thought I'd be asking. There are things in our forests that we don't understand. Things that defy our neat categories and scientific explanations. When I drive through wooded areas now, especially at dusk, I find myself scanning the tree line constantly. Every shadow between the trees could be one of them. Every unexplained sound in the distance makes me wonder. It's changed how I see the wilderness. What I saw that day was real. It wasn't a bear, it wasn't a person, and it wasn't my imagination. It was a Sasquatch, a Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. It existed before I saw it, and it continues to exist now, moving through the forests of Duck Mountain with that same purposeful stride, largely undetected, but undeniably there. I don't have proof. I don't have photos or footprints or hair samples. All I have is what I saw with my own eyes in broad daylight on a clear autumn day, and that has to be enough, because it's all I've got. I keep thinking about those eyes, those knowing eyes that didn't even bother to look my way. They haunt me the most. Because if these creatures are real, and they're that aware, that intelligent, what else don't we know about the world around us? I go back and forth between wanting to share my story with everyone and wanting to keep it to myself. Who would believe me anyway? But I know what I saw, and now, so do you. Story 11. Back in August of 2019, I decided to take a solo backpacking trip through a section of the Caribou Wilderness in British Columbia. I'd been planning it for months, needed to clear my head after a rough breakup, and figured some time alone in the wilderness would help. I'm an experienced hiker, been doing this kind of stuff since I was a teenager, so I wasn't worried about being on my own. I'd read that a portion of the area had been hit by wildfires earlier that summer, and I was curious to see the aftermath. There's something weirdly beautiful about recently burned forests, like seeing the skeleton of something once alive. Plus, I figured the wildlife would be minimal in the burn zone, which meant fewer worries about bears. The first day of hiking went smoothly. The weather was perfect. Not too hot, light breeze, clear skies. I covered about 15 miles before I started looking for a place to camp. Around 6 in the evening, I found this small clearing near the edge of the burn zone. One side was the charred remains of the forest, blackened trees standing like tombstones against the sky. The other side was untouched forest, thick with pines and underbrush. The contrast was stark, life and death side by side. I set up my tent facing the living forest rather than the burned section. Don't know why, but staring at all those black trees while trying to fall asleep seemed depressing. After getting my tent situated, I started gathering firewood. The burn zone made this easy. Plenty of fallen branches that were dry enough to burn well. As the sun started setting, I got my fire going and heated up some dehydrated pasta. Nothing special, but after hiking all day, it tasted amazing. The temperature was dropping fast, which is typical for that area, even in August. I put on my fleece jacket and sat by the fire, enjoying the quiet. That's when I first noticed something felt off. It wasn't anything I could put my finger on at first, just a feeling. You know how sometimes you can sense when you're being watched? It was like that, but more intense. The hair on my arms stood up despite the warmth of the fire. I looked around, scanning the tree line. The light was fading fast, turning everything into shadows. In the living forest, darkness was already pooling between the trees. The burned section was easier to see through, with no foliage to block what little light remained. I told myself it was nothing, probably just an animal curious about the human in its territory, maybe a deer or an elk. I'd seen plenty of wildlife during the day, so it made sense there'd be some around at night too, but the feeling wouldn't go away. In fact, it got stronger. I added more wood to the fire, building it up higher than I normally would. The extra light seemed to push back the darkness, and for a moment, I felt a little better. I took out my headlamp and put it on, just to have it ready. That's when I heard the first sound. It was a crack, like a branch breaking under weight. It came from the burned section of forest, maybe 50 yards away. I swung my head in that direction, flicking on my headlamp. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating the charred trunks, but showed nothing moving. "Hello?" I called out, immediately feeling stupid. I knew there shouldn't be anyone else out here. I hadn't seen another person all day, and this wasn't exactly a popular trail. No answer, just the soft crackling of my fire and the occasional pop of burning wood. I kept my headlamp on, scanning the tree line every few minutes. The night had become completely dark now, with no moon visible yet. The stars were incredible, though, one benefit of being far from city lights. At around 9:30, I decided to turn in. The weird feeling had faded somewhat, and I figured I was just being paranoid. I doused my fire carefully, making sure it was completely out, then brushed my teeth and crawled into my tent. I lay there for maybe 20 minutes, listening to the night sounds and trying to relax. I was just starting to drift off when I heard it, a low, rumbling sound. Not quite a growl, not quite a groan. It was deep, almost below the threshold of hearing, more felt than heard, and it was close, maybe just beyond the clearing. My eyes snapped open. I lay perfectly still, straining to hear. Had I imagined it? Then it came again, louder this time, definitely real. It sounded wrong, not like any animal I'd ever heard before. Too deep for a bear, too guttural for an elk. It was primal, ancient somehow. I slowly sat up, trying not to make noise. My heart was hammering so hard, I was sure whatever was out there could hear it. I reached for my flashlight, not the headlamp, but my heavy mag light that could double as a weapon if needed. Another sound, branches snapping, underbrush being crushed. Something big was moving around out there, and it was circling my camp. I unzipped my tent as quietly as possible and peeked out. The clearing was dark now that my fire was out, but my eyes had adjusted enough to see shapes. I couldn't see anything moving, but the sounds continued. They seemed to be coming from the direction of the living forest now, not the burn zone. I stepped out of my tent, flashlight gripped tightly in my hand. I wasn't sure what to do. Making noise sometimes scares off animals, but I didn't want to provoke whatever this was either. "Hey!" I shouted, trying to sound confident. "Get out of here!" The forest went completely silent. No more movement, no more strange sounds, just absolute silence. Even the normal night sounds, insects, the rustle of leaves in the breeze, had stopped. It was like the whole forest was holding its breath. That silence was somehow worse than the noises. It felt expectant, like something was waiting. I stood there for what felt like forever, but was probably only a minute or two. Then I heard it. Footsteps. Heavy, deliberate footsteps moving slowly through the underbrush, and they were getting closer. I swung my flashlight toward the sound, clicking it on. The beam cut through the darkness, illuminating trees and bushes, but nothing else. Yet the footsteps continued, now from a slightly different direction, as if whatever it was had moved when I pointed the light at it. "I have bear spray," I called out, which was true. I had it in my tent, not in my hand where it would have been useful. The footsteps stopped again. Then I heard a sound that turned my blood to ice. A low, huffing breath, like something huge exhaling, and it was close, maybe 20 feet away, just beyond the beam of my flashlight. I backed up slowly toward my tent, keeping the light pointed in the direction of the sound. I needed to get the bear spray, but as I moved, the footsteps started again, paralleling my movement. It was keeping pace with me, staying just out of the light. I reached my tent and fumbled behind me for the zipper, not taking my eyes off the tree line. As I found it and started to open the tent, I heard a rush of movement from the forest edge. I swung the light toward it and caught a glimpse of something massive moving between the trees. Just a flash of dark shape, too big to be a bear, too fast for how large it was, and too wrong in its proportions, too tall, too broad across the shoulders. I dove into my tent, zipping it up behind me with shaking hands. I knew the thin fabric wouldn't protect me from anything, but it was a psychological barrier at least. I grabbed my bear spray and held it ready, along with my knife. Then I just sat there, listening. The footsteps circled my tent, slow, deliberate steps that made the ground vibrate slightly. Whatever it was huge. I could hear its breathing too, deep, rhythmic breaths that sometimes turned into that strange huffing sound. I was terrified to make any noise, but I knew I needed to do something. I had my phone, but there was no signal out here. I had a satellite communicator for emergencies, but it was in my backpack across the tent. I'd have to move to get it. As I shifted slightly, the footsteps stopped, right outside my tent. So close I could hear the creature breathing. I froze, not daring to move. Then came a new sound, sniffing. It was smelling my tent, smelling me, long, deep inhalations that made the tent fabric move slightly. I held my breath, clutching the bear spray with white knuckles. My entire body was trembling. The sniffing moved around the tent, following my scent. Then it stopped at the door of my tent, right where I was sitting. I could feel its presence through the thin nylon, like a wall of heat and mass just inches away. The breathing was loud now, each exhale hitting the tent like a gust of warm, damp wind. Then it touched the tent, not with a paw or a claw, but with what felt like fingers. Long, powerful fingers that pressed against the fabric, feeling the shape of it, feeling for me. I bit down on my fist to keep from screaming. The fingers moved across the tent, probing, searching. They found the zipper and paused. In that moment, I was certain I was going to die. Whatever was out there was intelligent enough to understand zippers. It wasn't just some animal. The zipper started to move, just a fraction of an inch. I raised the bear spray, aiming at the opening, ready to empty the entire can into whatever face appeared. Then, from somewhere deep in the forest, came a howl, but not like a wolf. This was different. Higher, more haunting, but with that same deep quality as the breathing outside my tent, like something calling from the bottom of a well. The fingers froze, the zipper stopped moving. Another howl came, closer this time, then another, from a different direction. There were more of them out there. The presence outside my tent withdrew its hand. I heard those heavy footsteps again, moving away from the tent, toward the calls. There was a pause, and then an answering howl from right at the edge of the clearing, so loud it seemed to vibrate through my chest. Then it moved off, crashing through the underbrush with much less stealth than before, as if responding to an urgent summons. I sat there in the dark, unable to move, unable to think. I don't know how long I stayed like that. Minutes, hours maybe. Eventually, I heard normal forest sounds returning, insects chirping, the occasional rustle of small nocturnal animals. But I didn't sleep. I couldn't. When the first grey light of dawn filtered through my tent, I packed up faster than I ever have before. I didn't even make coffee or breakfast. I just needed to get out of there. As I was shoving my sleeping bag into its stuff sack, I noticed something on the outside of my tent, marks in the fabric. I went outside to look and felt my stomach drop. 5 distinct depressions in the nylon, spaced like fingers, and they were huge, much larger than my hand could make. Whatever had touched my tent had hands bigger than any humans. I practically ran the entire way back to my car. 18 miles in just under 6 hours, which is insane considering the terrain. I kept looking over my shoulder, kept feeling like something was following me, but I never saw anything. I still don't know what it was. I've researched local wildlife extensively since then, trying to find an explanation. Nothing fits. The closest thing I can come up with is, well, you know, but I've always been skeptical of those stories. At least I was until that night. I haven't told many people about this. Most would think I'm crazy or that I was just scared of normal forest noises. But I know what I experienced. Something intelligent was out there. Something that hunts in groups. Something that was curious about me. And sometimes when I'm trying to fall asleep, I still hear those howls, still feel those fingers on the tent, still wonder what would have happened if that zipper had opened all the way. Story 12. I've been hesitating to write this for almost a decade now. Part of me still doesn't want to talk about it, but I need to get this off my chest. I'm not looking for validation or trying to convince anyone. I know what I saw. It happened back in October 2014. I'd taken time off work for my annual elk hunting trip in the Bridger-Teton National Forest in Wyoming. I'd been hunting since I was 12. My dad taught me, but this was my third year going completely solo. There's something about being alone in the wilderness that I've always loved. Well, until that trip anyway. I'd gotten a 5-day permit and packed everything I needed. My Winchester .306, enough food, my tent, sleeping bag, the usual stuff. I drove out early on a Monday morning, parked at one of the less popular trailheads, and hiked about 6 miles in before setting up camp. The weather was perfect, crisp mornings, cool days, not too much wind, ideal hunting conditions. The first couple days were uneventful. I saw some elk sign, but nothing worth taking a shot at. By the third day, I decided to push deeper into the backcountry. Most hunters stick to areas within a few miles of the trails, but I wanted to get where the animals weren't constantly being pressured. Looking back, that was my first mistake. I woke up before dawn that Wednesday, had some instant coffee and a protein bar, and headed out in the dark. I'd spotted a promising basin the evening before, a nice mix of aspen and pine with a dry creek bed cutting through it. Perfect elk habitat. By first light, I was positioned on a ridge overlooking the whole area, sitting with my back against a large boulder. My rifle was across my lap, and I was just waiting for the sun to come up fully so I could glass the area. The morning was dead quiet. You know that stillness you only get in the deep woods, where you can hear a pine needle drop? That's what it was like. As the sun started to light up the basin, I raised my binoculars and began slowly scanning the area. That's when I noticed movement near the dry creek bed below, maybe 300 yards from my position. At first, I thought it was an elk or maybe a bear. I've seen plenty of black bears and even a few grizzlies over the years, but as I focused my binoculars, I realized this was something else entirely. The size was what hit me first. This thing was huge, tall and thick-bodied in a way that didn't match any animal I knew. It was walking upright along the creek, taking these heavy, deliberate steps. My heart started racing immediately. I'm not a small guy, 6 foot even, and about 200 pounds, but this thing would have towered over me. It had to be over 7 feet tall, maybe closer to 8, and the mass of it. The shoulders were impossibly wide, the torso thick and powerful. I ducked down a bit behind the rocks, keeping just enough of a view to watch through my binoculars. The thing was covered in dark brown hair, almost black in places, especially across the shoulders and back. The hair wasn't smooth like a bear's. It looked rough and matted in clumps, especially around what I'd call the neck area. As it moved along the creek bed, its arms swung loosely at its sides, not like a person trying to walk like an ape. This was natural movement. The arms were proportionally longer than a human's would be, hanging down past where its knees would be. I remember thinking, this can't be real. But there it was, in broad daylight, less than 300 yards away. I wasn't hallucinating. I wasn't tired or hungry or dehydrated. I was seeing something that shouldn't exist. The creature approached a stand of pine trees near the creek bed. What happened next is something I'll never forget. It reached up, I mean way up, probably 9 feet off the ground, and began tearing huge chunks of bark off one of the larger pines, not scratching like a bear would, but deliberately stripping the bark with its hands. The strength was unbelievable. It was ripping off sections bigger than dinner plates, and I could hear the wood splintering from where I sat. Through my binoculars, I got a clear look at its hands as it worked. They were enormous, with thick fingers that looked almost stubby, but incredibly powerful. The nails weren't claws exactly, more like very thick, dark, blunt nails. As it turned slightly, I could see its profile. The face wasn't human, but it wasn't exactly ape-like either. It had a wide, flat nose and a heavy brow ridge that shadowed its eyes. The jaw was massive. While it tore at the trees, it made these sounds, deep, irritated grunts. Not quite animal, not quite human. They carried across the basin in the morning air. I was terrified it would hear my heartbeat. It was pounding so hard, I could feel it in my ears. After a few minutes of destroying the bark on that tree, it moved to another one and did the same thing. I have no idea why it was doing this, looking for insects maybe, or some kind of food under the bark, but the deliberate way it worked seemed almost angry, like it was taking out frustration on the trees. Suddenly, it stopped and turned its head. It looked directly across the creek bed, then lifted its head slightly and seemed to smell the air. I froze completely. Had it caught my scent? The wind was blowing across the basin, not up toward me, but these things can probably smell better than any human. After what felt like forever, but was probably only a few seconds, it turned away and continued walking with that same heavy, distinctive gait. Its feet made audible impacts on the ground, not like the near silent footfalls of even large animals like elk or moose. Each step had weight behind it. It moved toward thicker brush at the far end of the basin and disappeared from view. I stayed frozen in place for what must have been another hour, afraid to move, afraid it might circle back. My rifle suddenly felt inadequate. I'd brought it for elk, not for whatever this was. When I finally worked up the courage to move, I circled wide around to check out the trees it had damaged. I figured if I could find physical evidence, maybe I could convince myself I hadn't imagined the whole thing. The damage was worse up close. Bark had been stripped and scattered everywhere. Deep gouges penetrated into the wood itself. No bear did this. Bears leave distinctive claw marks. These were clearly made by hands. Powerful hands. I took a few photos with my phone, but they don't capture the scale or the force needed to do that kind of damage. I should have taken measurements or left something in the frame for scale, but honestly, I wasn't thinking clearly. I just wanted to document it quickly and get the hell out of there. I abandoned my hunt after that. I mean, I technically stayed the full 5 days as planned, but I didn't really hunt anymore. I moved my camp that afternoon, circling way around where I'd seen the creature. I didn't sleep much those last 2 nights. Every snap of a twig, every rustling leaf had me wide awake, heart pounding. I kept my rifle right next to my sleeping bag. On the 5th morning, I packed up early and hiked out faster than I've ever moved through the woods. I felt eyes on me the whole way back to my truck. Maybe that was just paranoia, but it felt real. I've only told a few people about what happened. My wife knows, and a couple close hunting buddies. Most people would think I'm crazy or making it up. Hell, sometimes I almost convince myself I imagined it, almost. But then I remember those hands tearing the bark off those trees, the sound of the wood splintering, the deep grunts, the way it moved. Not like a person in a suit, not like any known animal, something that had weight and presence and purpose. I still hunt, but never alone anymore, and never in that part of Bridger Teton. I stay closer to the main trails now, where other hunters go. I'm constantly scanning for signs, stripped bark, unusual tracks, broken branches at impossible heights. I know there are reports of similar things from all over the country. Sasquatch, Bigfoot, whatever you want to call it. I used to laugh at those stories. I don't laugh anymore. There are things in our forests that haven't made it into science books, things that don't want to be found. That day changed how I see the wilderness. It's still beautiful, still somewhere I want to be. But now I know it holds secrets. Deep, ancient secrets that maybe we're not supposed to understand. Sometimes I wonder if it knew I was there the whole time, if it was sending me a message by destroying those trees, a warning to stay away. If so, it worked. Some places aren't meant for us. Some things aren't meant to be seen. I've analyzed that encounter over and over in my mind for years now. What disturbs me most isn't just that these creatures exist. It's that they've managed to stay hidden so effectively. How smart must they be? How aware of us and our movements? How connected to those forests in ways we'll never understand? I don't have answers. All I have is what I saw that morning in October 2014. Something that shouldn't exist according to science, but does. Something powerful, intelligent, and deliberately avoiding human contact. Sometimes when I'm falling asleep, I still hear those deep grunts and the sound of bark being torn from trees. I still see those massive hands and that heavy brow, and I wonder if somewhere in Bridger Teton, it remembers me too. Story 13. I've been working up the courage to write this down for a while now. Even after all these years, my hands still get shaky when I think about it. This happened in July of 2006 near the Wabash River in western Indiana. I've told a few close friends, including my buddy Ethan Carter, but I've never posted it anywhere public before. For some background, I'm not some jumpy city guy who gets spooked by normal wildlife. I'm 6'7", about 300 pounds, and I've been hunting since I was 12. I've tracked deer through pitch-black woods, gone after coyotes at night, and even hunted wild hogs down south. Nothing in the woods has ever really scared me before this. That summer evening started like any other fishing trip. I'd been hitting this spot along the Wabash for years. It was kind of my secret spot where the catfish would practically jump into your bucket. It's pretty remote, about 2 miles down this old dirt logging road that winds through the bottomlands near the river. Not many people know about it, which is why the fishing's so good. I brought my dog Buck with me, a chocolate lab mix who's been my fishing and hunting partner for about 7 years at that point. Buck's solid, doesn't bark at shadows or get spooked easily. He's chased off coyotes from our property and stood his ground against an aggressive raccoon once. Not the kind of dog that gets scared without good reason. I'd spent most of the afternoon catching a decent haul of channel cats. Nothing huge, but enough to make it worth the trip. As the sun started setting, I packed up my gear. It was that time of evening when the light gets all golden and everything gets quiet. You know that time, when the daybirds stop singing but the night creatures haven't started up yet. There's this strange stillness in the air that always feels a little eerie, even to experienced outdoorsmen. I loaded my cooler and tackle box into the bed of my pickup and started driving out on that dirt road. It was bumpy as hell, so I was only going maybe 15 miles per hour. Buck was doing what he always did, running ahead of the truck about 30 or 40 yards, occasionally stopping to sniff something interesting before trotting ahead again. This was our routine. He'd run ahead, I'd follow in the truck, and we'd make our way out together. The road has a lot of bends and turns as it follows the natural contours of the land. There's thick brush and trees on both sides, mostly cottonwoods, sycamores, and dense underbrush. In some spots, the vegetation gets so thick, it creates a kind of tunnel effect over the road. It's the kind of place where you feel completely alone with nature. I was about halfway back to the main road when something happened that I still can't fully explain. Buck had just disappeared around one of those sharp bends in the road. Nothing unusual about that. He'd run ahead, I'd catch up in the truck, but as I rounded that same bend, I immediately noticed something was wrong. Buck was standing dead still in the middle of the dirt road, his body rigid, his ears were perked forward, and his tail was straight out behind him, classic pointer stance. But he wasn't pointing at a bird or small animal. He was staring at something just off the side of the road. I slowed the truck even more, squinting to see what had caught his attention. That's when I saw it. Standing just off the road, partially concealed by some brush but making no real effort to hide, was something. I say something because my brain couldn't immediately process what I was seeing. It was huge, at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. It was covered in dark hair, not fur exactly, but hair that looked almost matted in places. Its body was wide, not fat, but broad-shouldered and thick. The arms were what really got me. They hung down way below its waist, longer than any human arm should be, but the most unsettling thing was how it was standing, completely upright on 2 legs, just like a person. This wasn't a bear. I've seen plenty of bears in my life, and this wasn't one. Bears don't stand like that with that posture. This thing stood with its shoulders back, its head up, almost confident, for what felt like forever but was probably only a few seconds. I sat there in my truck, engine idling, just staring at this creature. And it stared back. That's what really shook me. It was looking right at me. Not with animal curiosity or fear, but with what I can only describe as awareness. Its eyes caught the fading sunlight in a way that made them appear to almost glow. It didn't blink, it didn't turn away, it just looked at me. Buck, who would chase after anything under normal circumstances, suddenly broke his frozen stance. But instead of barking or growling or approaching the thing, he did something I'd never seen him do before. He turned and sprinted back toward the truck, faster than I'd ever seen him run. Without making a sound, he leapt straight into the bed of my pickup, through the open tailgate. I could hear his claws scrabbling against the metal as he pressed himself against the cab window. That's when I really got scared. Buck wasn't the type to run from anything. If this thing had him terrified enough to flee without even a warning bark, that told me everything I needed to know. The creature still hadn't moved. It just stood there, slightly hunched forward now, its long arms hanging at its sides. I couldn't tell if it was aggressive, curious, or something else entirely, but I wasn't about to find out. I didn't even think about turning the truck around properly. I just threw it into reverse and started backing up as fast as I dared on that rough dirt road. My eyes never left the figure, which remained motionless as I retreated. After backing up around that bend in the road, I did a quick 3-point turn and got the hell out of there, driving faster than was safe on that rutted path. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my throat. My hands were sweating on the steering wheel. I kept checking my rearview mirror, half expecting to see that thing running after the truck. Buck stayed pressed against the back window of the cab, whining softly, something he never did. When I finally reached the main road, I didn't even stop to secure Buck properly in the truck. I just gunned it all the way home, checking my mirrors constantly. Later that night, after I'd calmed down somewhat, I tried to make sense of what I'd seen. Could it have been a bear? No way. The posture was all wrong, and the proportions didn't match. A person in a costume, out there miles from anywhere, standing silently in the brush? That made even less sense. The only description that fit what I saw was, well, Bigfoot. I know how that sounds. I've always rolled my eyes at those stories, but I don't know what else to call it. An upright, hair-covered humanoid creature that was way too big to be a person and moved nothing like any animal I know. The thing that bothers me most wasn't just seeing it, it was the way it looked at me, like it knew exactly what I was, while I had no idea what it was. There was intelligence there, and that's what keeps me up at night sometimes. I told my buddy Ethan about it a few days later. He's one of the few people I've shared this with who didn't immediately try to explain it away or laugh it off. He actually seemed to take it seriously, which I appreciate. I haven't been back to that fishing spot since, not even in broad daylight. I know that probably sounds ridiculous coming from someone my size who's hunted dangerous game before. But something about that encounter fundamentally changed how I feel about being alone in those woods. I still fish the Wabash, but I stick to the more populated areas now. I don't go out at dusk anymore, and I definitely don't venture down those remote dirt roads alone. Buck changed too. He's more cautious now, especially at night. He'll sometimes stop and stare into the darkness at the edge of our property, hackles raised, like he's remembering something. When I think about it rationally, the Wabash River area would be perfect for something like that to live undetected. There are stretches of those bottomlands that hardly anyone ever visits. Thick woods provide cover, the river provides water, and there's plenty of game for food. A creature could survive there for generations without much human contact. I've spent a lot of time researching similar encounters since then. It's surprising how many people have seen something similar in that general area over the years. Most don't report it officially because, well, who wants to be known as the local nutcase who claims they saw Bigfoot? I'm not trying to convince anyone of anything. I'm just sharing what happened to me. I can't explain it, and I'm not sure I want to. Some things are better left alone. But I know what I saw that evening by the Wabash River, and more importantly, I know what I felt. A primal fear, unlike anything I've experienced before or since. The kind of fear that's burned into your DNA from a time when humans weren't always at the top of the food chain. Whatever that thing was, it belonged there more than I did, and it knew it. Story 14. I've been hunting since I was 12, following my dad into the woods every season like clockwork. 23 years of experience later, I know the difference between a deer, an elk, and a bear. I know how they move, how they sound, and what their tracks look like. But what I saw last October, I still can't make sense of it. This happened in the Gifford-Pinchot area, where I've hunted for the past decade. It's mostly second-growth timber with patches of old growth scattered throughout. Perfect elk country, though sightings are rare these days. The weather was crisp but not freezing, typical fall morning with fog hanging between the trees. I'd headed out before sunrise, parking my truck at the logging road turnoff and hiking about 2 miles in. By mid-morning, I'd positioned myself on this small rise that gives a decent view of a clearing below. I was just scanning with my binoculars, not really expecting much. The sun had burned off most of the fog, and I was honestly thinking about whether I should move to a different spot when I caught movement about 150 yards away. My heart jumped, that familiar rush you get when you spot something. At first glance, I thought deer, but as I focused, I realized it was an elk, a young bull with small antlers. I couldn't believe my luck. Elk sightings in this particular area had become so rare that most guys I know had given up hunting them entirely. I slowly brought my rifle up, not to shoot necessarily, but to get a better look through my scope. The elk was just browsing, completely relaxed, pulling at shoots and moving slowly along the edge of the clearing. I remember thinking about whether I should take a shot or just enjoy the moment. That's when everything changed. Without any warning, no sound I could hear, no movement I could see, the elk's head snapped up, its whole body tensed, and then it bolted. Not the casual trot they sometimes do when mildly spooked, but a full-on panic run, crashing through the brush like its life depended on it. I was still processing what had scared it when I noticed different movement, about 50 feet behind where the elk had been. Something big was moving through the trees, not chasing the elk exactly, but running in a different direction, like they'd both been startled by the same thing. I swung my scope over and managed to track this thing for maybe 3 or 4 seconds before it disappeared behind a stand of thick firs. What I saw through that scope has been replaying in my mind ever since. It was upright, walking on 2 legs, but not like a human walks. It was moving fast with this weird rolling gait, arms swinging. The height is hard to gauge at that distance, but comparing it to the surrounding trees, it had to be at least 7 feet tall, maybe taller. Its entire body was covered in dark hair. Not black exactly, more like a deep brown color, but matted in places. The weirdest part, the detail that still sticks with me, was that it had what looked like moss or some kind of vegetation stuck to its upper back and shoulders, like it had been lying down or leaning against something covered in moss. The bits of green stood out against the dark fur. I'm not some Bigfoot enthusiast. I've always laughed at those shows and the blurry photos, but sitting there on that rise, rifle still held halfway to my shoulder, I couldn't think of anything else it could have been. No bear moves like that. No human looks like that. I sat there for maybe 5 minutes, trying to make sense of what I'd seen. My hands were shaking a bit, not from fear exactly, but from that adrenaline rush you get when something unexpected happens. I kept thinking, nobody's going to believe this. Eventually, I decided to check it out. I know, probably stupid, but I needed to see if there was any evidence. I couldn't just leave without knowing for sure. I marked my position on my GPS and started making my way down toward where I'd last seen the figure. It took me about 20 minutes to reach the area. On the way, I ran into 3 other hunters, a father and his 2 adult sons who were working their way up from the valley floor. I asked if they'd seen or heard anything unusual, trying not to sound crazy. They just shook their heads, said they'd heard some crashing through the brush, but assumed it was deer or maybe an elk. I mentioned that I thought I might have seen a Bigfoot, immediately regretting saying it out loud. The older guy chuckled, and one of the sons said something about how every hunter eventually sees a Bigfoot if they spend enough time in the woods alone. They continued on their way, and I felt like an idiot, but I kept going. I found where the elk had been browsing, obvious signs in the torn vegetation and hoofprints in the softer ground. Then I moved toward where I'd seen the figure disappear. The area was disturbed. Ferns and undergrowth flattened in a path about 3 feet wide. Could have been anything, though. What stopped me cold was what I found near a massive Douglas fir. In a patch of soft soil, there was a partial footprint. Not the whole foot, just the ball and toes. 3 toes were visible, including what had to be a big toe that was easily 4 times the size of my own. The impression was deep, too, pressed about 3 inches into soil that was pretty firm. Whatever left it had to be heavy, and it had been moving fast. I took out my phone to take a picture, but my hands were shaking so bad the photos came out blurry. By the time I steadied myself, I heard voices. Those same hunters were circling back, and I suddenly felt exposed and ridiculous. I put my phone away without getting a decent shot. I spent another hour searching the area, but didn't find anything else conclusive. No more tracks, no hair caught on branches that I could see. But the feeling of being watched was overwhelming. The woods had gone quiet. That unnatural silence that sometimes happens when something's disrupted the normal flow of forest life. When I finally decided to head back to my truck, I took a different route than I'd planned. I didn't want to admit it to myself, but I was avoiding the thick stands of trees where the figure had disappeared. Every shadow between the trunks seemed deeper than it should have been. Every rustle in the undergrowth made me stop and listen. I've been back to those woods since then, but never alone. I've tried to find that exact location again to look for more evidence, but either I've gotten the spot wrong or there's nothing left to find. The few people I've told, close friends, my brother, have had the same reaction as those hunters. Amused disbelief. But here's what keeps me up at night. That thing moved like it knew the woods, the way it disappeared so quickly, how it seemed to know exactly where to go. It wasn't random, and the vegetation stuck to its fur. That suggests it had been lying still, maybe watching before something, those other hunters probably, disturbed it. The same thing that spooked the elk. What if it hadn't been running away from the hunters, but moving to avoid being seen by them? What if it had been watching me too, before I ever spotted it? I've tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was a bear with mange. Maybe it was some other hunter in a ghillie suit. But bears don't walk upright for that long, especially when running. And no hunter I've ever met wears a suit that looks like that, or moves through dense forest that quickly. The more I think about it, the more convinced I am that what I saw was a Bigfoot. I've spent countless hours since then reading accounts from other people, looking at reported sightings in the area. Some details match up eerily well: the height, the coloration, the way it moved. One report from just 2 years ago, about 15 miles from where I was hunting, mentioned the same detail about vegetation stuck to the creature's fur. The person who reported it theorized that these things might use natural camouflage, intentionally covering themselves with moss or leaves. I don't know if I believe that, but the coincidence is hard to ignore. I went back this past season with a better camera and a voice recorder. Didn't see anything unusual, but I did find an area where several saplings had been broken. Not cut, not chewed by animals, but snapped about 5 feet up. Could be nothing, could be something. I'm not asking anyone to believe me. Most days, I'm not sure I believe it myself, but I know what I saw through that scope. I know what that footprint looked like, and I know that the woods don't feel the same to me anymore. Every time I'm out there now, I catch myself scanning the tree line, looking for movement that doesn't belong. I listen harder for sounds that shouldn't be there, and sometimes, when the forest goes quiet for no reason, I pack up my gear and head back to the truck a little faster than I used to. What bothers me most isn't the possibility that these creatures might be real. It's the thought that they've always been there, watching us from the shadows between the trees, and we've been too blind or too stubborn to notice. Story 15. I still can't believe it's been nearly 30 years since that night in Helen. I've told a few people over the years, but most just laugh it off or change the subject. Figured I'd finally put it all down here where folks might actually listen. It was the summer of 1990, right before my senior year of college. Me and 5 of my buddies decided to do a weekend camping trip in North Georgia. We were all from Georgia Tech, stressed out from finals, and just wanted to get away from Atlanta for a bit. The plan was simple: hike during the day, drink some beers around a campfire at night, and forget about differential equations for a while. We picked a spot outside Helen, off State Route 75, just north of the upper Chattahoochee River recreation area. Not exactly wilderness, but remote enough that we could be loud without bothering anyone. We weren't really experienced outdoorsmen or anything, just college kids with cheap tents from Walmart and way too many hot dogs. The first day went fine. We set up camp about a mile from where we parked, found a decent clearing near a small stream, and spent the afternoon hiking around. By nightfall, we had a decent fire going and were a few beers in, telling the same dumb stories we always told when we got together. It was close to midnight when Mark said he needed to take a leak and wandered off toward the trees. He came back a minute later looking weird. "Hey guys, there's something on that ridge over there," he said, pointing across the small valley that bordered our campsite. We were all pretty buzzed, so at first nobody really cared. But Mark kept insisting, so eventually we all got up and followed him to the edge of our clearing. The moon was nearly full that night, so visibility was surprisingly good once your eyes adjusted. That's when I saw it. About 200 yards away, on top of a ridge, was a silhouette. At first, I thought it might be a dead tree or something, but then it moved. It was crouched down, kind of hunched over, but then it stood up to its full height. I remember feeling suddenly very sober. The figure was massive, way taller than any person I'd ever seen. In the moonlight, I could make out a bulky shape, but no details of the face or features, just this huge, dark silhouette against the night sky. We all froze, not saying a word. Then it happened. The thing turned slightly, and in one fluid motion, it just jumped. Not like a little hop, but a massive leap that carried it completely over the backside of the ridge. It cleared at least 20 or 30 feet in a single bound, striding away from us. What struck me most wasn't just the distance it covered, but how silently it moved. Something that big should have made noise, branches breaking, leaves rustling, something, but there was nothing. Just this enormous shadow flowing over the landscape like it was weightless. For a split second, I wondered if we were all having some kind of mass hallucination, but then Tyler whispered, "What the fuck was that?" And I knew everyone had seen it. The panic hit us all at once. We didn't discuss it. We just started grabbing our stuff. Nobody wanted to say what we were all thinking, but we all knew we'd seen something that shouldn't exist. Within 10 minutes, we had packed everything, left some stuff behind too, like our cooler and some camping chairs, and were practically running back to the cars. The hike back felt like it took forever. Every snapping twig made us jump. I kept looking over my shoulder, half expecting to see that silhouette following us. The rational part of my brain kept saying it was just a bear, maybe standing on its hind legs. But bears don't jump like that. They don't move that silently, and they're not 8 feet tall. We made it back to the cars and got the hell out of there. The whole drive back to Atlanta, nobody said much. We were all processing what we'd seen. By the time we reached campus, the sun was coming up, and we'd managed to convince ourselves it must have been a trick of the moonlight, or maybe a large deer that looked bigger than it was. But I knew better. What I saw that night wasn't any animal I recognized. For years, I tried to forget about it. I graduated, got a job in agricultural marketing, started dating my now wife. But that silhouette on the ridge kept appearing in my dreams. I'd wake up in a cold sweat, remembering how it had moved. So unnatural, yet so fluid. Fast forward to 2006. 16 years had passed, and I was visiting my parents in Augusta. My dad and I were having a beer on the porch, and somehow the conversation turned to camping. Without really thinking, I started telling him about that night in Helen. I expected him to laugh it off like everyone else had. My dad was the ultimate skeptic. 30 years in the army had left him with little patience for nonsense, as he called it. But instead, he got this thoughtful look on his face and asked me a bunch of questions about exactly where we were and what I'd seen. After a long pause, he said, "Let's go check it out." I was shocked. My dad wanting to investigate what was essentially a Bigfoot sighting. It didn't make sense, but he insisted, saying he had a week off and wanted to do some camping anyway. Looking back, I think he was just humoring me, wanting to show me there was nothing to be afraid of. So the next weekend, we loaded up his old Ford and headed to Helen. I was nervous as hell driving up State Route 75. It had been 16 years, but I still remembered exactly where to turn off. The logging road we parked on was more overgrown now, but otherwise, the area looked the same. We hiked in and set up camp not far from where I'd been with my college buddies. It wasn't the exact same spot. I couldn't remember precisely where that had been, but it was in the same general area. The ridge where I'd seen the figure was visible from our campsite, maybe 300 yards away. As we were setting up the tents, I noticed something odd. There was a smell in the air, kind of musky and rotten, like wet dog mixed with garbage that had been sitting in the sun too long. I mentioned it to my dad, but he just shrugged and said it was probably a dead animal nearby. The smell came and went throughout the afternoon. Sometimes it was so strong it made my eyes water, and other times it disappeared completely. My dad noticed it too eventually, though he still insisted it was just some carrion somewhere in the woods. That night we built a fire and cooked some steaks on his portable grill. Despite my anxiety about being back there, it was nice spending time with my dad. We talked about work, my mom, my younger brother's new job in Seattle, normal stuff. But I kept glancing at the ridge, half expecting to see that silhouette again. Nothing happened that night. We turned in around 10, and I lay awake in my tent for hours, listening to every sound in the forest. Eventually, I drifted off. The next morning, we were making coffee when a park ranger pulled up on an ATV. He was doing rounds, checking on campers. My dad offered him some coffee and he accepted, sitting down with us for a few minutes. "You guys might want to be careful with your food," the ranger said. We've had some issues with a bear in this area. My dad asked him what kind of issues, and the ranger explained that a couple of campers the previous weekend had their site completely ransacked. Coolers torn open, tents shredded, the works. Did they see the bear? I asked, feeling that old familiar tightness in my chest. The ranger shook his head. Nope, never actually saw it. Just came back from a day hike and found their camp destroyed. Whatever did it was long gone. After the ranger left, my dad and I decided to do some exploring. We hiked toward the ridge where I'd seen the figure years before. As we got closer, that smell returned. Stronger than ever. It was so bad I had to pull my shirt up over my nose. Jesus, my dad muttered. Something definitely died around here. But we couldn't find any carcass or anything that would explain the smell. It seemed to be everywhere and nowhere at the same time. We spent about an hour exploring the ridge and the area beyond it. Nothing seemed unusual until my dad called me over to look at something. About 10 feet off the ground, a young sapling, maybe 4 inches in diameter, had been twisted completely around itself, like someone had grabbed it and wrung it like a wet towel. The tree was still alive, its leaves green, but the trunk was mangled in a way I'd never seen before. My dad stared at it for a long time. He'd grown up hunting and fishing in rural Georgia, spent time in the woods his whole life, and served in Vietnam. There wasn't much in nature that surprised him. "I've never seen anything like this," he finally said. "No storm could do this, and it's too high up for a bear." We stood there looking at that twisted tree, neither of us saying what we were thinking. The smell was overwhelming at this point, making my stomach turn. Without discussing it, we both decided it was time to head back to camp. That night, we heard things moving around in the dark. Not small animals, heavy footsteps circling our campsite, just outside the ring of light from our fire. My dad kept his shotgun across his lap the whole time, something I'd never seen him do before in all our camping trips. "Bear," he kept saying, but I could tell he didn't believe it. Bears make noise. They snap twigs and rustle leaves. Whatever was out there moved like a ghost. The smell came and went all night, sometimes so strong we could taste it. We didn't sleep much, and at first light, we packed up and left. Neither of us suggested staying the second night we'd planned. On the drive home, my dad finally asked, "How big would you say that thing was?" "The one you saw back in '90? I'd thought about this a lot over the years. In my job, I often had to estimate the weight and size of livestock for marketing purposes. 8 feet tall, at least," I said. "Probably around 600 pounds, but built differently than you'd expect. Narrower in the shoulders than what you see in that Patterson film everyone knows, but still way bigger than any human." My dad nodded slowly, eyes fixed on the road ahead. "I believe you saw something," he finally said. That was as close as he'd ever come to admitting there might be things in this world that defy explanation. We never went back to that spot again, and my dad passed away in 2014 without us ever really discussing it further. But sometimes, when I'm alone in the woods, I catch that smell again, just for a moment, and I remember that silhouette on the ridge, moving with impossible silence and grace for something so massive. I don't know what's out there in the forests of North Georgia. I don't know if it's the same thing people have been reporting for hundreds of years. But I know what I saw that night in 1990 wasn't human, and it wasn't any known animal either, and sometimes I swear it's still watching me. Story 16. I never really thought I'd be sharing this, but I need to get it off my chest. I've been holding on to this experience for years now, trying to rationalize it away, but I can't anymore. It all started back in the summer of 2010. My wife Amy and I had planned this big family get-together at this beautiful secluded lake in Harrison County, Ohio. We'd invited my sister and her whole family, her husband, their 3 kids, and even their dog. We were all excited because this spot was perfect. Totally off the beaten path where we could fish without being bothered by other people. The lake itself was gorgeous, surrounded by these massive old trees. To get to our fishing spot, you had to walk down this narrow, winding trail through really dense woods for about 40 yards. It wasn't far, but the forest was thick enough that once you were on that trail, you couldn't see the parking area or the lake until you reached either end. That day had been perfect. Weather in the low 80s, just enough clouds to keep the sun from being too brutal. The kids were having a blast catching bluegill. My brother-in-law was grilling hot dogs, and everything felt right with the world. As evening started to set in, Amy realized she'd left her favorite chair in our van. It was getting darker, so I offered to walk back with her to grab it. The sun was setting, and the woods were getting pretty dark under the canopy. We were about halfway down the trail when we heard it. This sound. I still get goosebumps thinking about it. It was this weird whooping noise, not super loud, but definitely close by. Maybe 30 yards off the trail. Amy froze and grabbed my arm. "What was that?" she whispered. I tried to play it cool. "Probably just an owl," I said. But even as the words left my mouth, I knew that wasn't right. I've heard plenty of owls in my life. This was different. It was deeper, more resonant, almost purposeful. It went something like whoop, 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 with this weird cadence that just felt intelligent, if that makes any sense. We stood completely still for what felt like forever, but was probably only 20 seconds or so. Then we heard it again, slightly more distant, like whatever made the sound was moving away from us. Amy was visibly shaken. "Dan, that's not an owl," she whispered. "Let's just get to the van," I said, trying to sound calm despite the fact that my heart was pounding. We walked faster, constantly looking over our shoulders. I kept telling myself it was nothing, just some bird I wasn't familiar with, but deep down, something felt wrong about that sound. It wasn't natural. We grabbed the chair from the van and practically jogged back to our family. I didn't mention the sound to anyone else, didn't want to freak the kids out or seem paranoid. Amy and I exchanged glances a few times, but we silently agreed to let it go. We packed up as the last light faded and drove home without incident. I pretty much forgot about it after a few weeks, wrote it off as one of those weird, unexplained things that happen in the woods. But then, almost a year later, everything changed. Amy was home alone watching TV while I was working late. When I got home, she was sitting on the couch, looking pale. "You need to see this," she said, rewinding something on the DVR. It was some documentary about Bigfoot. I almost laughed. Amy had never been into that kind of stuff, but then she played a clip and my blood ran cold. The exact same whooping sound we'd heard in the woods played through our TV speakers, identical. The narrator called it a classic Sasquatch vocalization recorded in the Pacific Northwest. Amy looked at me with wide eyes. "That's it, Dan. That's exactly what we heard." I tried to rationalize it. "It's probably just a similar bird call," I said, but my voice lacked conviction. The sound was too unique, too specific. "It wasn't a bird," Amy insisted. "We heard a Bigfoot call in those woods." I didn't know what to think. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or cryptids, but I couldn't deny what we'd heard, and the more I thought about it, the more I started connecting other strange things that had happened on our property over the years. See, we own about 20 acres in Harrison County, not far from that lake. My grandpa left it to me when he passed, and we built a small main cabin and 2 guest cabins for when family visits. It's beautiful land, hilly, wooded, with a small stream running through it. Over the 25 years we've owned it, there have been incidents, things I'd always dismissed or explained away. Like the tracks we'd find sometimes after heavy rains, too big to be human, with a strange gait unlike any deer or bear, or the screams we'd hear deep in the night. Not quite a mountain lion, not quite human, but something in between that would make the hair on your neck stand up. There were the wood-knocking sounds too, sharp, deliberate taps that would sometimes echo through the hollow, usually in sets of 3. We'd also occasionally find deer carcasses that didn't make sense. Legs broken in ways that predators don't typically do, organs removed with almost surgical precision, and the trees. Some of the younger trees would be bent and twisted in unnatural formations, sometimes 15 feet off the ground, where no human could reach without equipment. But it wasn't until this past weekend that I became absolutely certain something is out there. Something is watching us. We had 10 overnight guests staying in our cabins, my sister's family again, plus some friends from college and their kids. It was a reunion of sorts. The evening had been great. Cookout, campfire, stories, the whole 9 yards. Our dog Rusty, this super chill chocolate lab who barely barks at anything, started acting weird around 8 in the evening. He was staring across the hollow toward the thick stand of pines, growling low in his throat. His hackles were up, and he wouldn't come when called, completely out of character for him. "What's he seeing?" my sister asked, peering into the darkness. "Probably just a raccoon," I said, but I didn't believe it. Rusty knows what raccoons smell like. This was something different. As everyone was heading to bed around 11, a couple of our friends mentioned smelling something strange near the edge of the clearing. They described it as musky, like wet dog mixed with skunk and something rotten. The smell was strong enough that my friend Mike actually checked his shoes to make sure he hadn't stepped in something. But the smell seemed to disappear as quickly as it came. I lay awake that night listening. Around 3:30 in the morning it started, knock, 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 loud rhythmic sounds, like someone hitting a baseball bat against a tree trunk. 3 knocks, pause, 3 more knocks. It continued for about 5 minutes, moving around the perimeter of our property. I wasn't the only one who heard it. In the morning, 6 of our 10 guests mentioned being woken up by the sounds. My nephew, who's 13, swore he saw a large shadow move past his window right after the knocking stopped, but he couldn't make out what it was in the darkness. What really convinced me, though, was what we found the next morning. About 50 yards from the main cabin, just inside the tree line, there was an arrangement of sticks that hadn't been there the day before. 3 thick branches, each about 4 feet long, arranged in a perfect triangle with smaller sticks placed at each corner. It wasn't something that could have happened naturally. Something or someone had built it overnight. But here's the thing. We're nearly a mile from the nearest neighbor, down a private road with a locked gate. No one could have wandered onto our property accidentally, and the thought of someone sneaking around our cabins at night, deliberately trying to scare us, seems even more far-fetched than the alternative. I've spent hours researching since then. Turns out Harrison County has a long history of Bigfoot sightings going back decades. Most happen in the eastern part of the county, where our property is located. The terrain there is perfect for something that wants to remain hidden. Deep ravines, dense forest, plenty of caves, minimal human presence. Last night I set up a trail camera facing that stand of pines where Rusty was staring. I haven't checked it yet, honestly, because I'm afraid of what I might see. Part of me hopes it shows nothing. That would be easier to deal with. But another part of me needs to know what's out there. The weirdest part is how this has changed how I feel about our property. This place has always been my sanctuary, somewhere I felt completely safe and at peace. Now I find myself scanning the tree line, listening for sounds that don't belong. I catch myself wondering if we're being watched whenever we're outside. Amy thinks we should talk to someone who knows about these things. Maybe bring in an investigator or someone who specializes in Bigfoot research. I'm hesitant. What if they find nothing and think we're crazy? Or worse, what if they find something and other people start coming around trying to hunt whatever is out there? Because that's the thing. If something has been living in these woods for all these years without bothering us, maybe we should just leave it alone. It hasn't tried to hurt us. Maybe it's just curious about us, the same way we're curious about it. But those knocks in the middle of the night, they felt like a message, like something letting us know that this is its territory, that it knows we're here, that it's watching. And I can't shake the feeling that whatever made that whooping sound back in 2010 is the same thing that's been visiting our property all these years. I don't know what to do now. Every noise in the woods makes me jump. I've started keeping Rusty inside at night. I'm considering motion-activated lights around the cabins. But deep down, I know if something 7 or 8 feet tall that knows these woods better than I do wants to get close to us, there's not much I can do to stop it. So I guess I'm sharing this to see if anyone else in Harrison County has experienced anything similar. Because whatever's out there, I'm starting to think it's not just passing through. I think it's been here all along, watching us, learning our patterns. And I can't help but wonder what it wants. Story 17. I've been sitting on these experiences for a long time now. Almost 50 years have passed, and I still get goosebumps thinking about them. I've never been the type to believe in monsters or things that go bump in the night, but what happened to me between 72 and 74 changed me forever. Back then, I worked for Sea and Summit Expeditions, running wilderness programs for troubled kids. Great job, loved it. We used the outdoors to help these kids find themselves, build confidence, all that good stuff. But there were 6 incidents during that time that I can't explain away, no matter how hard I try. The first one still gives me chills. We were setting up an old abandoned Girl Scout camp in Sequoia National Forest. Beautiful place, but remote as hell. This particular night, most of the staff were sleeping in this old cabin. I had my dog Whiskey with me, loyal German Shepherd mix, who wasn't afraid of anything. It must have been around 2 in the morning when Whiskey suddenly bolted up and ran outside barking like crazy. I mean, he was angry at something, then nothing, complete silence. That's when my stomach dropped. Whiskey never shut up that quickly. A minute later, he came back inside with his tail between his legs, shaking like he'd seen the devil himself. I'd never seen him like that before or since. I was about to get up to check what had spooked him when I heard it. Footsteps. Not normal footsteps either. These were heavy, like unnaturally heavy. The kind where you feel the vibration through the floor. They were coming toward the cabin, and the stride length was all wrong. Too long. What should have been many steps across the front of the cabin seemed to be just 2 or 3 massive strides. Whatever it was, passed right by our front door. I was frozen in place, just listening as it crossed the entire length of our cabin in what seemed like 2 steps. 2 steps. Do you understand how impossible that is? Our cabin wasn't small. I barely slept that night. When morning came, I discovered everyone else had been awake too. Nobody wanted to be the first to mention it. A couple of the other staff said they'd heard what sounded like logs being thrown around on the hilltop above us, heavy objects being picked up and slammed down repeatedly. We checked later and found nothing disturbed, but the feeling of dread lingered. The second incident happened a few weeks later. 2 of our staff were practicing archery near the main camp. I wasn't there for this one, but they told me everything right after. They heard this ungodly screaming coming from near the outhouses, not a human scream, not an animal scream either, at least not any animal they recognized. They described it as a cross between a woman screaming and something primal and angry. They freaked out, ran to the kitchen, locked themselves in, and grabbed their bows with arrows ready. They were terrified. Whatever made that sound screamed twice more, and they swore it was right outside the kitchen door the last time. They stayed locked in until other staff returned. We searched the area afterward and found nothing. No tracks, no evidence, nothing disturbed. But those 2 guys, both experienced outdoorsmen, were pale as ghosts for days. The third incident happened to me personally, and it's the one I have the hardest time talking about. I was camping with one of our climbing instructors in a remote area. Middle of the night, I woke up to this low, rumbling growl. It wasn't coming from our campsite. It was coming from right next to my companion's sleeping bag, maybe 5 feet from me. I froze, trying to process what I was hearing. That's when I felt my sleeping bag being slowly pulled away from my body. I grabbed it and pulled it back. Then it happened again. Something was trying to pull my sleeping bag off me, and I couldn't see what it was doing it. The third time, I was actually lifted off the ground about 6 inches while still in my bag, then dropped back down. I was paralyzed with fear, convinced I was about to die. Eventually, whatever it was moved away. I didn't sleep another minute that night. When I told my companion in the morning, he just laughed it off, said I must have had a nightmare. But I know what I felt. Something physically lifted me off the ground 3 times, and I heard that growl clear as day. The fourth incident involved our students. We had them doing solo wilderness experiences, where they camp alone for a day to reflect and gain confidence. We were nearby but kept our distance to give them that feeling of self-reliance. Around dusk, we heard emergency whistles blowing from multiple locations almost simultaneously. We rushed to check on the kids and found them all freaked out. 5 different students, spread out along a stream about 50 yards apart from each other, all reported seeing the same thing: a large, hairy creature walking on its hind legs through the willow thickets along the water. These were city kids. Most had never been in the wilderness before this program. They didn't know each other's positions, couldn't communicate with each other, yet they all described the same thing at the same time. We gathered everyone together and left the area immediately. The 5th incident happened during winter. We'd gone up to check on the camp during the off-season. There had been a decent snowfall the night before, about 8 inches of fresh powder. I was walking around the perimeter when I spotted tracks I couldn't identify. I've spent my entire life outdoors. I know what bear tracks look like, what mountain lion tracks look like, what every native animal in those mountains leaves behind. These were different. They were about the same length as my boot, but half again as wide. The toes were clearly defined, including an elongated big toe. The stride length was insane, around 4.5 feet between prints. I called over one of our staff who'd been a hunter his whole life. He examined them carefully and confirmed they weren't from any animal he recognized. We followed them for about half a mile before losing the trail where the snow had started to melt in a sunny patch. The final incident happened later that same day. A different group of our staff had found another set of similar tracks and followed them. They came to a spot where it looked like the creature had stopped and stood still for a while. From that position, there was a clear view of the road we had all just traveled up. The tracks then went straight up a gully through vegetation so thick that we would have had to crawl through it. Whatever made those tracks just push through like it was nothing. I've spent decades trying to rationalize what happened during those years. I've come up with logical explanations for some things. Maybe the growling was a bear, maybe the screams were a mountain lion, maybe the tracks were some elaborate hoax. But put together, I can't shake the feeling that we were being watched and occasionally interacted with by something that didn't want to be fully seen. I was never a believer in Sasquatch or Bigfoot before these experiences. I'm still not sure what I believe. All I know is that since those incidents, I've never felt comfortable in the backcountry alone. Something about those experiences fundamentally changed my relationship with the wilderness. I still go hiking and camping, but never alone, and I'm always hyper-aware of my surroundings. The footsteps outside that cabin, the inhuman screams, being physically lifted off the ground, the synchronized sightings by our students, and those distinctive tracks in the snow, they've stayed with me all these years. Whatever was out there in Sequoia National Forest between 72 and 74, it wasn't just wildlife, and it wasn't just my imagination. Sometimes I wonder if it's still there, watching hikers and campers from just beyond the tree line. And sometimes, when I'm lying in bed at night and hear something heavy walking outside my house for just a split second, I'm back in that cabin with whiskey trembling at my side, listening to those impossibly long strides passing by my door. Story 18. I was a fifth grade teacher at Three Rivers Elementary back in May 2018, and what I witnessed that day changed me forever. I've never been one to believe in monsters or cryptids or whatever you want to call them, but what happened that spring day in our small Texas town has left me questioning everything I thought I knew. It was a Thursday, I remember, because we had our weekly staff meeting scheduled for that afternoon. The weather was perfect, warm, but not yet hitting that brutal Texas summer heat. The kind of day where you're grateful to have playground duty because being outside feels like a gift. I was supervising lunch recess, standing near the swings, while about 30 kids were scattered across the playground. Our school sits right at the edge of town, and the back of our property borders this thick line of trees that follows an old creek bed. It's been dry for years, but the trees are still dense there. We've got this chain link fence that separates the playground from those woods, about 8 feet tall. Most days, the kids stay near the playground equipment or play kickball in the field, but that day, a group of 6 or 7 students were playing near the back fence. They were third graders, mostly 8 and 9 years old. Good kids, not the type to make up stories or cause trouble. I was helping a first grader tie her shoe when I heard it. Not screaming exactly, but that high-pitched mix of shock and fear that makes your stomach drop. When I looked up, I saw the group of kids backing away from the fence, pointing toward the tree line. My first thought was snake. We get them sometimes, especially near that back area, but these kids weren't running like they'd seen a snake. They were frozen, almost, moving backward slowly, their eyes fixed on something in the trees. I started walking toward them, calling out, "What's wrong?" But they didn't even look at me. That's when I knew something was really off. Kids that age always look to adults when they're scared. As I got closer, I heard Micah Lewis say, "It's watching us." His voice was barely above a whisper. I followed their gaze, scanning the tree line, and that's when I saw it. About 20 yards beyond the fence, partially hidden behind some brush, was something huge. My brain tried to make sense of it. A bear? No, we don't have bears around here. A person in a costume? But why would anyone? It was standing upright like a person, but much taller. I'd guess 7 or 8 feet at minimum. It had reddish-brown hair covering its body, thick and matted. The proportions were all wrong for a human. Incredibly broad shoulders and chest, with arms that hung down almost to its knees. Its face was darker than the rest of its body, like exposed skin. But I couldn't make out detailed features from that distance. What struck me most was how still it was. It didn't move or make any sound. It just stood there, watching the children. I felt like I was moving through molasses as I reached the kids and put my arms out instinctively to shield them. "Get back to the building," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "Now walk, don't run." The creature still hadn't moved. Part of me wanted to convince myself it was just a shadow or a trick of the light, but there was no denying what was standing there. I backed away with the kids, never taking my eyes off it. That's when little Emma Wilson started crying, which seemed to break the spell. Suddenly, all the kids were running toward the school building, yelling for help. I took one last look, and I swear to God, the thing tilted its head slightly, like it was curious about our reaction. Then it turned and moved back into the trees, not running, just deliberately stepping backward until the brush swallowed it up. The way it moved was so fluid, nothing like a person in a costume would move. By the time my colleague Sarah came outside to see what was happening, the creature was gone. The kids were all talking at once, trying to explain what they'd seen. It was big. It had hair all over. It was looking right at us, Miss Daniels. Principal Wallace came out and tried to calm everyone down. He suggested it might have been a stray cow that wandered up from one of the nearby ranches, or maybe someone playing a prank, but I knew better. We all did. The kids were consistent in what they'd seen. The height, the hair, the long arms, the dark face. This wasn't confusion or mass hysteria. They were describing the same thing I saw. Wallace decided to end school early that day. We called parents to come pick up their children, citing a disturbance near the property without specifics. While we waited, I sat with the kids who had been closest to the fence. They were still shaken, but kids are resilient. They were already comparing notes on what they'd seen. Its eyes were dark, like little marbles, said Micah. I saw its mouth, Emma added. It was wide and straight, with tight lips, and the skin around it was darker. It had messy hair, another boy, Tyler, chimed in, like it had stuff stuck in it. Leaves and grass, maybe. I didn't share what I'd seen. I was supposed to be the adult, the one reassuring them. But inside, I was terrified. I've been in these woods my whole life. I know every animal native to South Texas, and whatever this was, it wasn't from around here. The next few days were strange. On Friday, barely half the students showed up for class. Rumors had already spread through our small town. Some parents called the school demanding to know what happened, while others kept their kids home entirely. Mr. Guzman, our janitor, went out to check the fence line that afternoon. He came back white as a sheet, asking to speak to Principal Wallace privately. Later, Wallace told the staff that Guzman had found tracks along the fence, large footprints, bigger than any boot, with what looked like toe impressions. The stride length between them was massive, over 4 feet apart in some places. The local sheriff came out to look, but by then it had rained a little overnight, and the prints weren't as clear. He took some photos and made a report, but you could tell he was just going through the motions. In his mind, it was probably just some kids or hunters messing around. That weekend, things got weirder. People living in the houses behind the school started reporting strange things. Dogs barking frantically at the tree line, heavy movements through the brush late at night, loud cracking sounds, like branches snapping under something heavy. One woman said her motion sensor lights kept coming on, but when she looked outside, she never saw anything. By Monday, the Johnson family, who lived directly behind the school, reported that something had broken into their shed. The door was bent inward like it had been forced, and bags of deer feed were ripped open. Several fence boards separating their property from the woods were broken outward, as if something heavy had pushed through from their yard back into the trees. Little Micah Lewis, one of the boys who'd seen the creature up close, couldn't sleep for a week. His mom told me he kept insisting the big thing from the fence was outside his window at night. She thought he was just processing his fear, but when she mentioned it to other parents, 3 more families said their kids were saying the same thing. The school board held an emergency meeting the following Tuesday. They decided to install additional lighting around the playground and cut back some of the brush near the fence. They also hired a security guard to patrol the grounds at night for 2 weeks. Nothing else was found or seen during that time. Gradually, things returned to a kind of normal, but it was a new normal. The kids wouldn't play near the back fence anymore. During PE, they'd stay clustered in the middle of the field, keeping their distance from the trees. One student, a quiet 4th grader named Zoe, started drawing the creature in class, always the same image, tall, hairy, with those distinctive long arms. As for me, I found myself watching the tree line whenever I was on playground duty. I bought a powerful flashlight that I kept in my desk drawer, though I'm not sure what good it would have done. I started leaving school before dark. About a month after the incident, I was staying late grading papers. It was dusk when I finally packed up to leave. As I walked to my car, I heard a sound from the direction of the woods, a low, rumbling sound, almost like a groan, but deeper than any human could make. I got in my car so fast, I dropped my keys twice, trying to get them in the ignition. I've talked to wildlife experts, shown them the few photos Guzman took of the tracks. They all say the same thing: it doesn't match any known animal in the region. One guy suggested it might have been a black bear standing on its hind legs. But we haven't had bears in this part of Texas for 100 years, and what I saw was no bear. It's been 5 years now, and I've since moved to a different school district. Not because of what happened, at least that's what I tell myself, but because my husband got a job in San Antonio. Sometimes I still dream about it, though. That still, watchful presence at the edge of the woods, those impossibly long arms, the way it tilted its head before retreating into the trees. The kids who saw it that day are in high school now. I wonder if they still remember, or if they've convinced themselves it was something else, something explainable. I wish I could do the same. I don't know what we saw that day at Three Rivers Elementary. I don't know if it was what some people call a Bigfoot or Sasquatch or something else entirely. All I know is that it was real. It was watching our children, and somewhere out there in the woods of South Texas, it might still be watching. And that thought keeps me up at night more often than I'd like to admit.